1997, Hilarious History to Fall Asleep, The Silicon Frontier by Mark Twain. Copyright 2026, James Henderson. Chapter 1. The Great Comet's Farewell. I have been informed by entities of questionable corporeal status and even more dubious fashion sense that the current year is 1997. To a man who spent his primary years dodging steamboat explosions and trying to convince the world that a white suit is appropriate for all seasons, this is a bit of a shock to the system. I feel like a man who went to sleep in a quiet library and woke up inside a brass band's tuba during a particularly enthusiastic rehearsal of The Stars and Stripes Forever. The world of 1997 is a frantic, buzzing hive of digital bees. People carry small plastic rectangles that beep at them like needy infants, and they spend an inordinate amount of time staring into glowing boxes that provide them with more information than any human brain was ever designed to hold, most of it concerning the dietary habits of cats in distant cities. But amidst all this progress, there was a moment when the entire human race stopped, put down their pagers, and looked up. They had to. A celestial intruder had arrived, and it was far too bright to be ignored by anything short of a professional hermit. The return of the cosmic tenant. I have a long-standing, somewhat intimate relationship with comets. I came in with Halley's Comet in 1835, and I went out with it in 1910. I've always considered the great author of this universe to be a man of consistent literary symmetry. If he brings a character onto the stage with a grand, fiery flourish, it's only polite to give him a matching exit. I've always viewed Halley's as my personal valet, reliable, predictable, and possessing a certain dignity that comes from only showing up once every 76 years, just to make sure the furniture hasn't been moved. But in 1997, we were graced by Hale Bopp. Now, if Halley's is my brother, Hale Bopp is that flamboyant cousin from the city who arrives unannounced, stays for 18 months, drinks all the good bourbon, and insists on telling everyone how much better the view is from the penthouse. It was a show-off of a comet. It stayed visible to the naked eye for a record-breaking length of time, roughly from the moment people started worrying about their New Year's resolutions, until they had long since abandoned them in favor of deep-fried appetizers. Hale Bopp was the brightest comet seen in decades, a great, icy smudge across the velvet of the night sky, sporting two tails like a cosmic tuxedo. One tail was dust, the other was gas, rather like a politician, if you think about it, though the comet had the decency to remain silent. The view from the porch of progress. There is something profoundly humbling about a comet. In 1997, man was feeling particularly smug. He had mapped the human genome, he had built a space station, and he was perfecting a way to send a picture of his breakfast across the globe in under 3 minutes. He felt he had finally put nature in her place, tucked her into a neat little folder labeled Environment, to be addressed later. Then Hale Bopp showed up. It didn't care about our fiber optic cables. It didn't care about the burgeoning World Wide Web, which I am told is a sort of giant, invisible spiderweb where people go to argue with strangers about things they don't understand. The comet simply hung there, a dirty snowball the size of a mountain hurtling through the vacuum at speeds that would make a locomotive look like a paralyzed snail. I spent many a night in 1997, in my mind at least, sitting on a porch that smelled of honeysuckle and old cigars, looking up at that thing. It's a curious feeling, watching a rock that won't be back for another 2,000 years. It gives a man perspective. It makes the emergency of a malfunctioning fax machine seem like a very small thing indeed. I've always said that the secret to a long and happy life is to ignore any problem that won't matter in a century. Hail Bop is a reminder that most of our problems won't matter in a week, let alone a millennium. The industry of awe. Naturally, because we are humans, we couldn't just look at the comet. We had to try and own it. In 1997, the comet industry was in full swing. There were telescopes being sold that claimed to see the very pores on a Martian's nose. There were commemorative T-shirts, coffee mugs, and I suspect Hail Bop-flavored sodas that tasted mostly of ozone and disappointment. I read an account of a man who spent $4,000 on a camera lens just to take a photograph of the comet. He spent 3 months adjusting his apertures and his shutters, calculating the rotation of the Earth and the humidity of the air. When he finally took the picture, it looked like a blurry Q-tip floating in a bowl of ink. He was devastated. Meanwhile, a 6-year-old boy in Missouri looked up, pointed a sticky finger at the sky, and said, "Look, Papa, the sky is leaking." And he understood more about the majesty of the universe than the man with the $4,000 lens ever would. We have a peculiar habit of overcomplicating our awe. We think that if we don't document a thing with a machine, it didn't truly happen. I tell you, the best way to see a comet is with a pair of eyes that have recently been washed with wonder and a mind that isn't currently preoccupied with the price of Apple stock, which, I'm told, is a company that sells computers, though why they named it after a fruit that caused so much trouble for Adam and Eve is beyond my humble comprehension. The fringe and the folly. Of course, no great celestial event would be complete without the lunatic fringe. Humans have always had a difficult relationship with the sky. We see a sign in the heavens and immediately assume it's a personal message addressed to us, usually involving instructions to do something remarkably stupid. In 1997, there was a group of folks who convinced themselves that behind Hail Bop, hidden in its tail like a stowaway in a cargo hold, was a giant spaceship coming to take them to a better world. Now, I've seen some strange things in my time. I once saw a man eat an entire dictionary on a dare. But the idea that a galactic civilization would travel trillions of miles just to pick up a few dozen people in California seems like a very poor return on investment. It's a tragedy, of course, but it speaks to that eternal human itch, the desire to be somewhere else. We are the only creatures on Earth who are perpetually dissatisfied with the here and now. We have a perfectly good planet, full of dogs to pet and books to read and rivers to navigate, and yet we spend half our lives staring at a comet and hoping it's a bus to a better neighborhood. A cometary benediction. As the months wore on, Hail Bop began its long, lonely arc back into the cold suburban reaches of the solar system. It grew dimmer, retreating like a guest who realizes they've stayed past the point of politeness. I watched it fade with a certain melancholy. There is something comforting about a constant in the sky. For a year and a half, you could walk outside, look up, and be reminded that you were part of a very large, very strange, and very beautiful clockwork. It made the squabbles of 1997, the politics, the scandals, the arguments over whether a man should wear his hair in a mullet, a hairstyle that suggests the wearer is conducting business in the front and a riot in the back, seem appropriately insignificant. When the comet finally vanished from view, the world went back to its glowing boxes and its beeping rectangles. We turned our eyes back down to the mud and the silicon. But for a brief window, Hale-Bopp made us a race of astronomers. It forced us to acknowledge that we are all hitchhikers on a very small, very damp rock, hurtling through the dark. I've always said that heaven is a place where you can stay in bed all day and read, but I think a small corner of it must be reserved for the comets. They are the punctuation marks of the universe. They remind us that the story is long, the author is clever, and that every once in a while it's worth the effort to look up from your screen and realize that the sky is putting on a show for free, just because it can. Hale-Bopp may be gone, but it left a smudge on the collective memory of 1997. It was a year of farewells, as they say. But before the world could lose its heart to the tragedies on the ground, it had to lose its mind, just a little bit, to the light in the sky. And if you ask me, a little bit of celestial madness is exactly what a species needs to keep from going completely insane from the mundane. Now, if you'll excuse me, I believe someone is trying to explain to me what a Tamagotchi is, and I have a feeling I'm going to need a very large glass of scotch to understand the answer. Chapter 2. The Day the Human Brain Faltered. There is an old saying, likely coined by someone who had just lost a wager at a riverboat faro table, that man is the measure of all things. It is a lovely, comforting sentiment that suggests we are the gold standard of the universe, the pinnacle of creation, and the only creatures capable of figuring out how to fold a fitted sheet, though I have yet to meet a man who can actually accomplish that feat. However, in May of 1997, that golden measure seemed to have been replaced by a yardstick made of silicon and hubris. I am speaking, of course, of the great chess match between Garry Kasparov, a man whose brain functions at the speed of a startled gazelle, and a collection of IBM circuitry known as Deep Blue. The duel of the century and the circuits. Now, I have always had a complicated relationship with the game of chess. It is a pastime that requires the patience of a glacier and the strategic foresight of a general, yet it offers the physical excitement of watching paint dry in a damp cellar. It is a game where two people sit in funereal silence for hours on end, occasionally moving a small wooden horse, only to eventually realize they've wasted a perfectly good afternoon. But to the world of 1997, this match was more than a game. It was a holy war. It was John Henry versus the steam drill. But instead of hammers and steel, we were using bishops and knights. On one side, you had Kasparov, the world champion, a man with a brow so furrowed you could plant potatoes in the creases of his concentration. On the other side, you had a tall black cabinet that looked like it should be dispensing chilled sodas rather than outmaneuvering the greatest strategic mind of the human race. I've always said that the more things a man can do, the more important he thinks he is. But here was a machine that could do only one thing: calculate 200 million chess positions per second. And it made the entire human race feel like they'd been demoted to the rank of slightly clever primates. The ghost in the silicon. I watched the accounts of this match with a mix of fascination and a deep, abiding pity for Mr. Kasparov. You see, a human being plays chess with his nerves, his ego, and his stomach. When Kasparov made a move, he felt the weight of history, the pressure of his reputation, and likely the indigestion from a hurried lunch. Deep Blue, on the other hand, felt absolutely nothing. It didn't care if it won. It didn't care if it lost. It didn't care if it was being watched by millions or if it was being used as a very expensive paperweight in an empty basement. It had no gumption. It had no soul. It just had an infinite capacity for arithmetic. And that, I suspect, is what truly rattled the champion. In the second game of the match, the machine made a move that was so, well, human, that Kasparov became convinced there was a grandmaster hidden inside the cabinet, or perhaps a telepathic Russian spy whispering through the wires. The machine had played with a sense of long-term strategy that machines weren't supposed to possess. It wasn't just crunching numbers, it seemed to be scheming. That is the great terror of the modern age, the moment the toaster starts to look like it's judging your choice of bread. The calculation of 1 billion moves. The scientists at IBM were immensely proud of themselves. They stood around in their short-sleeved shirts and pocket protectors, beaming like proud fathers at a graduation ceremony. They told the press that Deep Blue could examine 200 million positions per second. 200 million. I cannot even examine 200 million options for breakfast without falling back into a coma of indecision. But here is the rub. Calculating 1 billion moves is not the same thing as thinking. A machine can tell you the mathematical probability of a rainstorm, but it cannot tell you how the air smells right before the clouds burst. It can calculate the trajectory of a falling leaf, but it cannot feel the melancholy of autumn. Deep Blue could see the entire board until the end of time, but it had no idea what a night actually was. To the machine, a night was just a variable in an equation, a L-shaped nuisance to be neutralized. It didn't know the romance of the cavalry charge. It didn't know the nobility of the sacrifice. It was just doing laundry with logic. The final resignation. In the sixth and final game, the unthinkable happened. Kasparov, the man who had held the crown for 12 years, the man who looked like he could win a war just by staring intensely at a map, collapsed. He made a mistake in the opening, a blunder, as the chess fellows call it. It was the sort of mistake a schoolboy makes when he's distracted by a passing circus. The machine didn't hesitate. It didn't offer a polite cough. It didn't say, "Are you quite sure about that, Gary? You seem a bit piqued." It simply reached out with its mathematical claws and dismantled the champion in 19 moves. When Kasparov walked away from the table looking like a man who had just seen his childhood home sold at auction, the world gasped. The headlines shouted that the human era was over. They said that the machine age had finally conquered the biological age. I say, pish-tosh. Or perhaps something stronger, depending on who's listening. The dignity of the nap. We must keep our heads about us when it comes to these mechanical marvels. Yes, Deep Blue defeated Garry Kasparov at chess, but can Deep Blue tell a joke? Can it appreciate the irony of a politician's promise? Can it feel the sting of a well-worded insult or the warmth of a glass of port on a winter's night? No. The machine won because it doesn't have a heart to skip a beat. It won because it doesn't have a brain that gets tired of looking at the same 64 squares. But here is the ultimate victory for the human animal. After the match, Kasparov could go home, kiss his wife, have a magnificent dinner, and sink into the profound, blissful satisfaction of a well-earned nap. Deep Blue, meanwhile, was simply turned off. There is no glory in a victory you cannot feel. There is no triumph in a success you didn't work for. If I build a steam shovel that can dig a hole faster than 1,000 men, I haven't proven that the shovel is better than the men. I've only proven that I am very tired of digging holes. The future of the thinking box. As I looked at the world in 1997, I saw people beginning to worry. If a machine can beat us at chess, what's next? Will a machine write our novels? Will a machine compose our music? Will a machine eventually decide that humans are a bit too inefficient and suggest we all move to a nice, quiet retirement home in the suburbs of the asteroid belt? I suspect we are safe for a while. A machine might be able to string together words in a grammatically correct order, but it will never understand the mischief of a well-placed adjective. It will never know the sheer, unadulterated joy of a lie that is so grand, so magnificent, and so utterly unnecessary that it becomes a work of art. So let the IBM boys have their trophy. Let the silicon chips have their day in the sun. We humans will keep our blunders, our distractions, and our beautiful, inefficient emotions. Because at the end of the day, I would rather lose a game of chess to a friend and share a laugh over our mutual stupidity than win 1,000 matches against a box of wires that doesn't even know it's playing. Besides, I hear that even after defeating the world champion, Deep Blue still couldn't figure out how to program a VCR. So, who's the real master of the universe now? Chapter 3. The Mechanical Mutt on Mars. On the 4th of July, 1997, while the rest of the American populace was busy singeing their eyebrows over charcoal grills and celebrating their independence from a king they hadn't thought about since the previous July, a small group of people in Pasadena, California, were celebrating a different kind of liberation. They had successfully managed to throw a piece of luggage across 140 million miles of empty, terrifying vacuum and land it squarely on the surface of the red planet without it shattering into a billion pieces of expensive scrap metal. I am speaking, of course, of the Mars Pathfinder. Now, I have spent a fair portion of my life dealing with the frontier. I have seen the edges of the American West when they were still raw and unvarnished, where the only pathfinders were men with questionable hygiene and a disturbing tendency to shoot first and ask for directions later. But this new frontier, this Martian one, is a different breed of cat entirely. It is a desert so vast, so dry, and so remarkably devoid of a decent saloon that it makes the Nevada territory look like a lush tropical paradise. The art of the interplanetary bounce. The first thing that struck me about this mission was the method of arrival. When I traveled across the plains in a stagecoach, the goal was to keep the wheels on the ground. If the coach started bouncing, it generally meant you were about to meet your maker, or at the very least, lose your luggage and your dignity. But the scientists at NASA, who are clearly men possessed by a very high-functioning sort of madness, decided that the best way to land a multi-million-dollar scientific instrument on Mars was to wrap it in a bunch of giant beach balls and let it drop. Imagine it. A spacecraft hurtles toward a planet at speeds that would make a lightning bolt look sluggish, hits the atmosphere, deploys a parachute, and then, just before the moment of impact, inflates a cluster of airbags and simply bounces It bounced 15 times. It hopped across the Martian landscape like a caffeinated kangaroo. It is the only time in human history where falling down and rolling into a ditch was considered a triumph of engineering. I find a certain poetic justice in it. After centuries of thinking we are the masters of the universe, we finally reached another world by using the same physics as a toddler's playpen, the six-wheeled terrier. Once the Pathfinder stopped its undignified tumbling and opened its petals like a metal flower, out rolled the star of the show, Sojourner. Now, they call it a rover, but to my eyes it was a mechanical terrier. It was about the size of a microwave oven, possessed 6 small wheels, and moved with a cautious, sniffing gait that reminded me of a dog exploring a neighbor's backyard for the first time. It didn't have a tail to wag, but it had a radio modem, which I suppose is the digital equivalent of a friendly bark. I watched the grainy reddish footage, which, thanks to the miracle of the Internet, was being viewed by millions of people who should have been working, and I couldn't help but admire the little thing. It was 140 million miles from the nearest repair shop, surrounded by rocks that had been sitting in the same spot since the beginning of time, and its entire job was to roll up to those rocks and ask them what they were made of. Man is a curious creature. He won't walk to the corner store to buy a loaf of bread if he can find a way to drive, yet he will spend years of his life and hundreds of millions of dollars to send a toy car to another planet just to see if the dirt there is the same shade of red as the dirt in Arizona. Spoiler, it is. The naming of the stones. One of the most charming, or perhaps the most ridiculous aspects of the mission was the way the scientists named the rocks. When you are a scientist, you cannot simply say, "The little robot rolled over to a big rock." That isn't scientific. You have to give the rock a name so that you can talk to it in your reports as if it were an old friend. They named one rock Barnacle Bill. They named another Yogi. They even had one called Scooby-Doo. Think of it. Here's a planet named after the Roman god of war, a place of myth, mystery, and ancient celestial power. And we arrive and immediately start naming the scenery after Saturday morning cartoons. It is the ultimate human stamp. We don't just explore a place, we suburbanize it. I half expected Sojourner to find a rock shaped like a mailbox and start looking for the Sunday comics. But there is a logic to the madness. By naming the rocks, we make the infinite void feel a little less lonely. It's hard to be terrified of the cold, dead silence of the cosmos when you're busy checking the chemical composition of Yogi Bear, the Martian web, and the thirst for the beyond. In 1997, the World Wide Web was still a toddler, prone to falling over and making terrible screeching noises every time it tried to connect. But the Mars Pathfinder mission was the first time the public truly logged on to space. NASA's website was swamped. Millions of people sat in front of their glowing monitors, waiting for minutes at a time for a single photograph to download. You could see the image appearing line by line, like a slow-moving window shade being pulled up. "Is that a mountain?" someone would ask. "No, it's a rock," another would reply. "Is there life on it?" "It looks like a potato." And yet, we couldn't look away. Why? Because for the first time, we weren't just looking at a painting or a telescope's blurry guess. We were looking at the ground. We were seeing the view from the porch of another world. There is a fundamental itch in the human soul to see what is over the next hill. It drove the pioneers across the Atlantic. It drove the gold seekers to the Klondike. And in 1997, it drove the office workers of Cincinnati to stare at a digital image of a red rock for 45 minutes during their lunch break. We are a species that simply cannot mind our own business. If there is a there out there, we must go there, even if there is a frozen wasteland where your blood would boil if you stepped out without a pressurized suit. The loneliness of the machine. There was a certain melancholy to the mission, though. After a few months, the Pathfinder stopped talking. The batteries gave out, or the cold finally seeped into its mechanical joints, or perhaps it simply got tired of looking at Barnacle Bill and decided to take a permanent nap. Sojourner is still there, you know. Somewhere in the Ares Vallis, there sits a small six-wheeled microwave covered in red dust, perfectly preserved in the thin Martian air. It is a monument to our curiosity and our incredible capacity for throwing things away. I've often thought that if an alien race ever visits Mars, they won't find cities or canals or great monuments of a lost civilization. They will find a collection of our discarded toys, roamers, landers, and a few golf balls if the rumors about the moon are true. They will look at Sojourner and think, "My, what a strange, persistent little race of creatures. They couldn't even breathe here, yet they insisted on sending a scout to check the price of the real estate." A digital salute. I give 1997 credit. It was the year we realized that the frontier didn't end at the Pacific Ocean. It just got a lot harder to get to. Pathfinder proved that we could do great things on a budget, though a NASA budget would still buy enough cigars to keep me happy for 10,000 years. It proved that we didn't need a grand, heroic astronaut with a square jaw to explore the stars. We just needed a very clever box of wires and a willingness to bounce. As I look at the stars tonight, I find myself looking for that little red dot. Somewhere up there, a mechanical ghost is sitting in the silence, a pioneer that never came home. And while I still prefer a raft on the Mississippi to a rocket in the void, I have to tip my hat to the mechanical Mutt. It did what every great explorer does. It went somewhere impossible, looked around, and sent back word that the world was even bigger than we thought, even if it did spend most of its time talking to a rock named Scooby-Doo. Chapter 4. The Handover of the Pearl. I have often observed that the British Empire was a bit like a maiden aunt who collected porcelain cats. She had a great many of them. She wasn't entirely sure where they all came from, and she was deathly afraid that if she let one go, the whole shelf would come crashing down. For centuries, the British made it their business to go about the globe, planting flags in places where the locals already had perfectly good flags of their own, and then acting surprised when, eventually, the locals asked for their dirt back. But on July 1st, 1997, the British finally performed the most polite, damp, and dignified giving back in the history of grand-scale real estate. They returned Hong Kong to China. They called it the handover, which makes it sound like passing a salt shaker at a dinner table rather than the surrender of a glittering, neon-soaked metropolis of 6 million souls. The retail trick of the 99-year lease. The whole business was rooted in a piece of paper signed in 1898. a time I remember well, as I was busy then trying to figure out how to pay off my debts without actually having to work. The British, in their infinite wisdom and habitual greed, had secured a 99-year lease on the new territories of Hong Kong. Now, if you ask a man why he's signing a 99-year lease, he'll tell you it's because forever is a word that makes lawyers nervous. 99 years feels like an eternity when you're standing in the 19th century. To a British diplomat in 1898, the year 1997 was a fictional date, a shimmering mirage in a Jules Verne novel involving dirigibles and possibly Martians. They assumed that by the time the lease was up, either the world would have ended or they would have figured out a way to lose the paperwork. But time, as I have noticed, has a stubborn habit of moving forward even when it isn't invited. The years ticked by. The empire began to shrink like a wool suit in a hot wash, and suddenly the British found themselves standing at the end of the 20th century with a landlord knocking on the door and holding a very old, very legal-looking bill. A ceremony conducted in a teacup. The actual ceremony in 1997 was a masterclass in British stiff upper lipism. It was held at the stroke of midnight because, apparently, the fate of a global financial hub is best decided when everyone is slightly sleepy and wearing uncomfortable formal wear. The weather, however, refused to cooperate with the dignity of the occasion. It didn't just rain, it poured with a tropical ferocity that suggested the heavens were trying to wash the British influence right off the sidewalk. I've always said that God has a sense of humor, and watching the Prince of Wales, Prince Charles, trying to look regal while his medals were slowly being submerged in a monsoon was a bit of divine comedy. He looked like a man who had been invited to a garden party only to find out it was being held at the bottom of a lake. The British military performed their drills, their bagpipes skirled, and the Union Jack was lowered for the last time. There is something profoundly melancholy about a flag coming down. It's a silent admission that the party is over, the lights are being turned out, and you no longer own the lease on the refreshments. Prince Charles read a speech from the Queen, which I imagine said something to the effect of, "Sorry about the Opium Wars, here's your city back. Please don't forget to write." The arrival of the Red Star. Then came the Chinese. Jiang Zemin and his cohorts arrived with the patient, unblinking stare of a creditor who has waited an entire century to collect a debt. As the Chinese flag went up, the world held its breath. For the British, it was the sunset of the empire. For the Chinese, it was the end of national humiliation. It's funny how the same event can be a tragedy in one language and a victory parade in another. To the people of Hong Kong, however, it felt a bit like being a child in a divorce where both parents are arguing over who gets the silver, while the child is mostly worried about whether they'll still be allowed to play in the yard. The Chinese promised a policy called One Country, Two Systems. It is a fascinating concept, the kind of thing a politician comes up with when he wants to have his cake, eat it, and then convince the cake that it's actually a salad. They promised that for 50 years, Hong Kong could keep its capitalism, its courts, and its peculiar habit of making vast sums of money, while officially belonging to a communist mainland. It's like trying to keep a shark and a goldfish in the same bowl and telling the goldfish that the shark is just there for the administrative oversight. The departure of the Britannia. The most poignant moment for me was the departure of the Royal Yacht Britannia. As the clock struck midnight and the British officials boarded that grand old ship, they sailed out into the harbor and vanished into the mist. It was the final graceful exit of a landlord who had been told his services were no longer required. I've spent a lot of time on water, mostly on the Mississippi, where the stakes involve sandbars and snags rather than international treaties, and I know the feeling of leaving a dock for the last time. There is a weight to it. The Britannia wasn't just carrying a prince and a governor, it was carrying the last tattered remnants of an era where a small island in the North Atlantic could claim a pearl in the Orient. The British left behind a city of skyscrapers, tea-drinking habits, and a legal system that actually functioned, which is more than can be said for many places they visited. But they also left behind a people who were suddenly waking up in a new country without ever having moved their houses. Reflections on the Pearl of the Orient. Hong Kong is often called the Pearl of the Orient, and like a pearl, it was created through irritation. It grew out of the friction between two vastly different worlds, smoothed over by a century of trade and the relentless pursuit of the almighty dollar, or the Hong Kong dollar, which I am told is just as almighty in that part of the world. In 1997, the world was obsessed with what would happen next. Would the tanks roll in? Would the stock market vanish like a puff of smoke? Would the people of Hong Kong still be allowed to grumble about the government in the newspapers? I suspect that the pearl will be just fine for a while. Money has a way of silencing ideology. As long as Hong Kong remains a place where a man can turn a penny into a pound, both sides will likely find a way to coexist. But it was a stark reminder that even the grandest empires are merely temporary tenants on this earth. We spend our lives building walls and drawing lines in the dirt, but the dirt doesn't care. The dirt was there before the British arrived, and it will be there long after the last red-tasseled flag has faded. The sunset of certainty. As 1997 rolled on, the handover became a memory, a collection of damp photographs and commemorative coins. But it signaled a shift in the global weather. The West was no longer the only show in town. The East was rising, not with a sword, but with a ledger book and 1 billion hard-working hands. I find it ironic that at the same time we were sending robots to Mars, as I mentioned in the previous chapter, we were still busy arguing over who owns a tiny bit of coastline on our own planet. We can calculate the distance to the stars, but we still haven't figured out how to share a harbor without calling in the lawyers. But such is the human animal. We are a species of collectors and landlords perpetually worried about our leases. As the Britannia sailed into the darkness of the South China Sea, I couldn't help but tip my hat to the British. They may have been a nuisance for a few hundred years, but they certainly knew how to stage an exit. And now, with the pearl safely back in the dragon's mouth, the world turned its attention back to its glowing screens and its electronic mail, oblivious to the fact that the next great revolution wasn't going to involve flags at all. It was going to involve a boy with a lightning bolt on his forehead. Chapter 5. The Boy Who Lived. I have often maintained that the difference between the right word and the almost right word is the difference between lightning and a lightning bug. But in 1997, the world discovered that the difference between a common orphan and a literary orphan is the difference between a quiet life in a cupboard and a global monopoly on the imaginations of every human being between the ages of 8 and 88. In June of that year, while the information superhighway was being paved with the good intentions of people who didn't yet realize they were building a digital coliseum for arguing with strangers, a small, unassuming book appeared in the shops of London. It was called Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone. Its author was a woman named J.K. Rowling, who, I am told, wrote much of it in a cafe while nursing a single cup of lukewarm tea, an act of fiscal discipline and literary stamina that I find deeply admirable, having spent much of my own career trying to write while nursing much stronger beverages. The return of the low-tech miracle. Now, consider the irony of the timing. We were at that very moment patting ourselves on the back for our high-tech brilliance. We had robots on Mars, we had machines defeating chess champions, and we were convinced that the book was a dusty relic of a bygone age, destined to be replaced by something called a CD-ROM, which, as far as I can tell, was a shiny coaster that occasionally played a grainy video of a dancing hamster. And yet, what did the world fall in love with? Not a story about a brave computer programmer or a daring laser technician. No, we fell in love with a boy who lived in a hole under the stairs, who received his mail via a decrepit owl, and whose primary tool for navigating the world was a pointed stick. It is a delicious indictment of the human condition. Give a man a fiber optic cable that can transmit the collected knowledge of the ages in a blink, and he will use it to look up pictures of fancy hats. Give him a story about a hidden platform at a train station and a school for wizards, and he will follow you into the dark with a lantern and a smile. It seems that no matter how many gigabytes we cram into our pockets, we still possess a primitive, unquenchable thirst for a good old-fashioned lie, the kind of lie we call fiction, because it tells more truth than the morning newspaper ever could. The stupidity of experts. One of my favorite details about the birth of Harry Potter is the 12 rejections. Apparently, 12 different publishing houses, filled with men in expensive suits and women with very sensible glasses, read the manuscript and decided that a story about a wizard school was too long or too niche or not quite what the market is looking for. I love experts. Truly, I do. An expert is a person who can tell you exactly why something won't work, right up until the moment it does, at which point they will tell you they knew it was a winner all along. These publishers looked at a gold mine and saw only a pile of particularly heavy dirt. They didn't realize that children don't care about market trends. Children care about justice. They care about friendship. And they care very deeply about the idea that somewhere out there is a secret world where they are special and the adults are mostly ridiculous. Between you and me, that isn't just a child's fantasy. Most adults spend their entire lives hoping for the same thing, which is why so many of them were caught reading the book behind a copy of the Wall Street Journal. The British Boarding School with More Ghosts. The setting of the story is a British boarding school, a concept that has always struck me as a form of legalized child abandonment practiced by the upper classes. In a normal British boarding school, the primary hazards are cold porridge, bullying by boys named peers, and a curriculum designed to ensure you can recite Latin poetry while being completely incapable of fixing a leaky faucet. But Hogwarts was different. In Hogwarts, the porridge might try to eat you. The bullying involved being turned into a ferret, and the curriculum included potions and defense against the dark arts. I must say, I would have been a much better student if my geography teacher had the ability to turn into a cat at a moment's notice. It certainly would have kept me from staring out the window at the river. The brilliance of the tale, however, isn't in the magic. It's in the mundane nature of the magic. The wizards have bureaucracy. They have banks run by surly goblins, which, in my experience, is exactly how most banks are run. They have sports, Quidditch, which is essentially a version of polo played by people who have a death wish and access to flying landscaping equipment. By making the magic feel like a tedious everyday chore, the author made the world feel more real than the one we were actually living in. The Philosopher's Stone, or the original IPO. The central MacGuffin of the first book is the Philosopher's Stone, a legendary rock that can turn lead into gold and grant eternal life. In 1997, we were calling this the dot-com boom. People were taking companies that didn't own anything but a catchy name and a few desks, and through the magic of the stock market, they were turning those leaden ideas into mountains of gold. It was the same alchemy, just with less interesting cloaks. The pursuit of eternal life is another one of those grand human follies that I've always found hilarious. Why anyone would want to live forever is beyond me. 70 years of dealing with politicians and gout is usually enough for any sane man. But Harry Potter, at the tender age of 11, realized what the experts and the alchemists never could, that the stone was a burden, not a prize. To the well-organized mind, death is but the next great adventure, a sentiment I find quite comforting, though I'm in no particular hurry to pack my bags. The Boy with the Scar. What truly captured the world's heart, I think, was the scar. Harry wasn't a hero because he was the strongest or the smartest. He was a hero because he had been marked by a tragedy, and he carried the evidence on his forehead. We all have our scars, though most of ours are hidden in the ledgers of our hearts or the wrinkles of our foreheads. In a decade that was increasingly obsessed with perfection, with airbrushed models and polished digital interfaces, here was a hero who was a bit of a mess, who wore broken glasses, and who was famous for something he couldn't even remember. It gave the world permission to be human again. It reminded us that the future wasn't just about faster modems and smaller chips. It was about the stories we tell our children to help them face the monsters under the bed. Monsters that in 1997 were starting to look a lot like corporate downsizing and global interconnectivity. The Great Awakening. By the end of the year, the Harry Potter phenomenon was beginning to boil. It hadn't yet become the multi-headed hydra of movies, theme parks, and plastic wands made in factories that would eventually conquer the planet, but the spark was lit. I watched as the information age was outmaneuvered by the imagination age. People who hadn't touched a book in years were suddenly staying up until 2 a.m. to find out if a fictional boy would survive a fictional encounter with a fictional wizard who didn't have a nose. It proves my theory that the human race is, at its core, a collection of dreamers who are temporarily trapped in the bodies of accountants. We need the magic to make the real bearable. We need to believe that there is a platform 9 3/4, because the platforms we have to stand on, the ones that lead to our jobs, our taxes, and our dental appointments, are simply too dull to contemplate without a bit of wizardry to spice things up. A final observation. As I look back on June of 1997, I see a world that was online, but out of touch. We were connecting the globe with wires, but we were forgetting how to connect with each other. And then along came a boy with a lightning bolt on his head, and suddenly everyone was talking about the same thing again. We were sharing a myth. The boy who lived didn't just survive a curse, he survived the 20th century. He reminded us that the most powerful technology ever invented isn't the silicon chip or the internal combustion engine. It's the sentence. It's the ability to say, "Once upon a time," and have the entire world lean in and listen, breathless, to hear what happens next. I've always said that the man who does not read has no advantage over the man who cannot read. In 1997, thanks to a woman in a cafe and a boy in a cupboard, a lot of people suddenly realized they had an advantage they had forgotten to use. And now, if you'll excuse me, I'm going to go see if I can find a stick in the yard that looks particularly magical. I have a few editors I'd like to turn into ferrets, purely for the sake of literary progress. Chapter 6. The Candle in the Wind. I have often observed that the human race is never so united as when it is collectively looking at something it shouldn't be, or mourning someone it never actually met. In the late summer of 1997, specifically on the 31st of August, the world's digital heart skipped a beat and then proceeded to break in a way that was both profoundly touching and remarkably theatrical. I am speaking of the death of Diana, Princess of Wales. Now, as a man who has spent a fair amount of time in the company of various highnesses and majesties, most of whom possess the charisma of a damp cellar and the intellectual curiosity of a turnip, I have always looked upon the institution of royalty with a skeptical eye. Royalty is at its core a grand theatrical production where the actors have forgotten they are wearing costumes and the audience has forgotten they paid for the tickets. But Diana was different. She was a people's princess, which is a polite way of saying she was the only member of that illustrious family who looked like she didn't have a ramrod for a spine and a piece of ice where her heart ought to be. The predator with the glass eye. The tragedy occurred in a tunnel in Paris, a city known for romance, fine wine, and a terrifying approach to automotive velocity. But the true villain of the piece wasn't the speed or the stone pillars, it was the paparazzi. Paparazzi is a curious word. It sounds like a spicy variety of Italian sausage, but in reality, it refers to a breed of human mosquito that feeds not on blood but on the image. In my day, if you wanted to capture a person's likeness, you had to ask them to sit still for 3 hours while you dabbed paint on a canvas, or at the very least, you had to explode a tray of magnesium powder in the face. It was a slow, deliberate, and generally respectful process. But by 1997, the camera had become a weapon of war. It was no longer a tool for art. It was a mechanical eye that never blinked, never slept, and never respected a no trespassing sign. These men on motorcycles chased the princess through the dark like hounds after a fox, all for the sake of a grainy photograph that they could sell to a tabloid for enough money to buy a small island. I call it the price of the lens. It is a peculiar modern bargain. We demand to see every intimate moment of a celebrity's life. And then we act shocked when the machinery we built to provide those moments eventually grinds the celebrity to dust. We want the goddess, but we treat her like a product. And when the product is destroyed in the pursuit of the image, the world pauses its breakfast to weep for the tragedy it helped finance. The Great Floral Tundra. The reaction to her death was something I can only describe as a global hysteria of the heart. Within hours, the gates of Kensington Palace were besieged, not by an angry mob, but by a mountain of flowers. I have seen gardens and I have seen funerals, but I have never seen a floral tundra. Millions upon millions of bouquets were piled high, wrapped in plastic that crinkled in the wind like a billion tiny sighs. It got to the point where you couldn't see the grass, the gates, or the sidewalk. The air in London must have smelled like a perfume factory had exploded in a botanical garden. I find it fascinating. Why do we give flowers to the dead? They can't smell them, they can't see them, and they certainly can't take them where they're going. I suspect the flowers weren't for Diana. They were for the people who bought them. They were a way of saying, I am sad and I spent £5 to prove it. We humans have a desperate need to make our internal feelings external, especially when we feel guilty. And the world felt a great deal of guilt in 1997. We realized that we had been the silent partners in that high-speed chase in Paris. Every time we bought a magazine with a secret photo, we were putting a gallon of gas in those motorcycles. The battle of the stiff upper lip. While the public was weeping in the streets, the royal family was tucked away in Balmoral, Scotland, behaving as if the most tragic event of the decade was a minor clerical error in the household accounts. The Queen, I am told, is a woman who views emotion as a dangerous foreign invention, like the bidet or the metric system. For several days, the old guard refused to fly the flag at half-mast, refused to come to London, and refused to acknowledge that the world had changed. They were operating on the 19th century manual of dignified silence, while the 20th century was screaming for visible grief. It was a clash of civilizations. On one side, you had the tradition of the stone face. On the other, you had the requirement of the television screen. In 1997, if an event doesn't happen on camera, the public assumes it didn't happen at all. The Queen eventually realized that if she didn't show her face and say something vaguely sympathetic, the British public might decide that royalty was an expensive luxury they could no longer afford, like a gold-plated carriage that doesn't have any wheels. She finally came down to London, looked at the flowers, and gave a speech. It was the moment the 19th century finally surrendered to the 21st. The firm had been outmaneuvered by a ghost, the song that shook the world. Then came the funeral. It was a grand, somber affair, watched by 2.5 billion people. Think of that. 2.5 billion people staring at a wooden box at the same time. It is the closest the human race has ever come to a collective consciousness, and we used it to watch a funeral. The highlight, of course, was Sir Elton John. He took a song he had originally written for Marilyn Monroe, Candle in the Wind, and scrubbed the lyrics to fit the occasion. Now, I've always been a fan of recycling. I've used the same basic joke about politicians in at least 4 different books. But this was recycling on a cosmic scale. He sang about England's rose, and the world dissolved into a puddle of tears. It was a beautiful melody, perfectly calculated to tug at the heartstrings of everyone from a duchess in Devon to a cab driver in Des Moines. It became the best-selling single of all time. There is a cynical part of me, the part that spent too much time in newsrooms, that notes the irony. Diana was killed by the media machine, and her funeral resulted in the greatest media product in the history of music. We turn our tragedies into anthems, and then we sell the anthems back to the mourners. It is a very efficient system, if a bit ghoulish. The legacy of the lens. As the candle flickered out and the flowers eventually wilted and were hauled away by the city's sanitation department, a job I do not envy, I found myself reflecting on what it all meant. 1997 was the year we realized that privacy is dead. If a princess cannot escape the lens in a dark tunnel in the middle of the night, what hope is there for the rest of us? We were entering an age where everyone would eventually carry a camera in their pocket, and everyone would become their own little paparazzo, documenting their dinner, their cats, and their tragedies for the benefit of a public that is always hungry and never satisfied. Diana was the first true martyr of the information age. She was loved not for what she did, though she did much good for the sick and the poor, but for how she looked and how she made us feel. She was a mirror. When we looked at her, we saw our own desires for romance, our own struggles with cold institutions, and our own vulnerability. I've always said that heaven is a place where you can stay in bed all day and read, but I hope for Diana's sake. It's also a place where there are no cameras, no motorcycles, and no royal protocol. I hope she's found a quiet spot by a river, perhaps the Mississippi. I can recommend a few good sandbars, where she can just be a person rather than a rose or a candle or a product. A final thought on the global village. They say the world became a global village in 1997. If that's true, then Diana's death was the moment we all stood around the village well and realized we were all thirsty for the same thing, a bit of genuine humanity in a world that was rapidly becoming made of silicon and plastic. We mourned her because she was real in a way that the glowing boxes and the beeping rectangles were not. And then, once the funeral was over, we turned our glowing boxes back on to see what the weather was like, and if the Y2K bug had started eating the banks yet. We are a fickle species, we humans. We will weep for a princess on a Saturday and argue about the price of eggs on Monday. But for 1 week in 1997, we were all quiet. We all looked up, and we all realized that even the brightest candle can't stand up to a stiff wind, especially when the wind is being whipped up by the propellers of 1,000 news helicopters. Now, if you'll excuse me, I find all this talk of funerals and flowers has made me uncommonly thirsty. I'm going to go find a beverage that hasn't been reimagined for a global audience. Chapter 7. The Think Different Era. I have always been a man who appreciates a good return. There is something inherently theatrical about a fellow who gets kicked out of his own house, wanders the wilderness for a decade, and then marches back through the front door just as the chimney is about to collapse, and the mortgage holders are circling the porch like buzzards at a bankruptcy hearing. In the world of business, we call this visionary leadership. In the world of the Mississippi, we usually just called it having the brass of a government mule. In 1997, the prodigal son in question was a fellow named Steve Jobs. He returned to a company called Apple, which, at the time, was a fruit that had gone remarkably soft and was beginning to smell of corporate rot. They hadn't had a hit in years, their bank account was leaking like a rusted bucket, and the experts, those wonderful people I mentioned who are always certain about things that have already happened, were busy writing the company's obituary. But Steve Jobs didn't come back to fix the pipes. He came back to change the very nature of water. The grammar of rebellion. The first thing the man did was launch a campaign called Think Different. Now, as a man who has spent several decades wrestling with the English language, trying to get it to sit up, roll over, and play dead, my first instinct was to reach for a red pen. It should, by all rights of the Queen's own grammar, be think differently. An adverb is a terrible thing to waste. But when I mentioned this to a young fellow in a black turtleneck, he looked at me as if I had just suggested we return to the era of the quill pen and the candle snuffer. "No, Mr. TwAIn," he said with the fervor of a man who has seen a burning bush. "It's not about how you think. It's about the thing you are thinking. Different is a noun here. It's a destination. I suppose that is the beauty of being a billionaire. You don't have to follow the rules of grammar because you can simply buy the dictionary and have the troublesome parts removed." But the more I looked at the campaign, the more I realized that Think Different was a stroke of marketing genius. It wasn't an instruction. It was a club membership. It told the public that if they bought a computer with a picture of a half-eaten piece of fruit on it, they weren't just buying a box of wires, they were joining the ranks of the rebels, the misfits, and the troublemakers. The gallery of the glorious misfits. The advertisements were everywhere, huge black and white photographs of people like Albert Einstein, Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., and John Lennon. It was a brilliant bit of humbug. Here was a company trying to sell a mass-produced electronic appliance by associating it with people who would have likely been baffled by a mouse that didn't require a trap. I found myself looking at these portraits and wondering, what does a man who led a non-violent revolution against the British Empire have to do with a spreadsheet? Did Einstein need a power book to figure out that E equals mc squared? I suspect he did most of his thinking different with a chalk stub and a messy head of hair. And yet, it worked. The Think Different campaign was the first time I saw a corporation try to sell a product by claiming it possessed a soul. They weren't selling speed or memory or the ability to print a recipe for potato salad. They were selling identity. They were telling the customer, you are a genius, and the only reason the world doesn't know it yet is because you're using the wrong brand of typewriter. I waited for my own photograph to appear in the series. I felt I fit the criteria perfectly. I've been a misfit and a troublemaker since the 1830s. And I've certainly thought differently about my creditors than they thought about me. But apparently, my brand wasn't quite translucent enough for the 1997 aesthetic. The Big Brother of Redmond. The most delicious irony of the year occurred at the Macworld Expo in Boston. Steve Jobs stood on a stage, looking, I must say, like a very fit monk, and announced a partnership with Microsoft. Now, you have to understand that to an Apple fan in 1997, Microsoft was the great Satan. Bill Gates was the man who had supposedly stolen the fire of the gods and sold it back to the masses in a clunky gray box. When Bill Gates's face appeared on a giant screen above the stage, looking like a benevolent, bespectacled big brother, the audience actually booed. It was a magnificent piece of theater. Jobs had to tell his rebels and misfits that their revolution was being funded by the very empire they were trying to overthrow. Microsoft invested $150 million to keep Apple afloat. It was a mercy killing in reverse. It was as if the King of England had sent a check to George Washington to help pay for the gunpowder at Yorktown. I've always said that a man who carries a cat by the tail learns something he can learn in no other way. Steve Jobs learned that even a visionary needs a bankroll. And Bill Gates learned that it's much better to have a different thinking rival who is alive and indebted to you than a dead one who might become a martyr. The rise of the ICEO. Jobs took the title of ICEO. He claimed the I stood for interim, but everyone knew it really stood for I. He was the sun around which the entire company orbited. He began simplifying the product line, which is corporate speak, for setting fire to everything that doesn't make a profit. He fired people with the same casual grace that a gardener pulls weeds. He understood something that most businessmen never do, that the public doesn't know what it wants until you show it to them, and even then, they'll only want it if you make it look like a piece of jewelry. I watch this with a certain amount of personal baggage. You see, I was once a technology visionary myself. I invested every cent I had, and quite a few cents I didn't have, into a contraption called the page compositor. It was a machine that was supposed to revolutionize the printing world. It had 18,000 parts. It could do the work of 6 men, and it had a temperament more volatile than a prima donna with a toothache. The page compositor failed because it was too complicated, too expensive, and it had a habit of breaking its own heart every time you turned it on. Steve Jobs' genius was the opposite. He wanted to make technology so simple that even a politician could use it, and so beautiful that you'd want to keep it on your mantelpiece. The cult of the translucent gumdrop. By the end of 1997, the groundwork was laid for what would become the iMac. I saw the early designs, computers made of translucent plastic in colors like Bondi blue. It was a revelation. Until then, computers had been beige, the color of oatmeal, of boredom, of the walls in a dentist's waiting room. Jobs realized that if you made a computer look like a giant glowing gumdrop, people would forgive the fact that it didn't have a floppy disk drive. A decision that caused more weeping and gnashing of teeth in 1997 than the loss of the British colonies. We were entering an age where the container was becoming more important than the content. We were no longer buying tools. We were buying experiences. I found it all a bit dizzying. I've always been content with a pen that writes and a cigar that stays lit, but the world of 1997 was convinced that if their computer didn't match their curtains, they were somehow failing at life. Reflections on the New Frontier. The Think Different era was the moment the Silicon Frontier moved from the laboratory to the living room. It was the moment that geeks, a word that used to refer to people who bit the heads off chickens in circuses, became the new aristocracy. Steve Jobs understood that in the modern world, perception is reality. If you tell people they are pioneers, they will follow you into the wilderness, even if the wilderness is just a store in a shopping mall. He turned a failing business into a secular religion, complete with its own saints, its own rituals, and its own tithes, which usually cost about $2,000 and became obsolete in 18 months. I tip my hat to the man. He was a humbug of the highest order, a showman who would have made P.T. Barnum look like a shy violet. He realized that the future wasn't about what a machine could do, but about how a machine made you feel. And as I look at the people around me, clutching their glowing fruit-branded rectangles as if they were holy relics, I realize that Jobs didn't just save a company. He invented a new way for humans to be lonely together. He gave us the tools to think different, but he also made sure we were all doing it in exactly the same way. It's a magnificent trick. I wish I'd thought of it back when I was trying to sell the Page Compositor. I should have just painted it Bondi blue and told everyone it was a misfit. I'd be a billionaire by now, and I'd have much better fitting suits. Chapter 8. The Red Envelope Revolution. I have always believed that the most powerful force in the universe, surpassing gravity, steam power, and even the monumental ego of a New York theater critic, is the human desire to avoid a $40 fine for a mistake one didn't even realize they were making. In the grand tapestry of human progress, we often credit our advancements to noble pursuits like liberty or enlightenment. But if you look closely at the seams, you'll find that most of our greatest revolutions were actually sparked by a man getting cheated out of a few nickels and deciding to set the world on fire in retaliation. In August of 1997, a gentleman by the name of Reed Hastings provided the world with such a spark. As the story goes, and I do love a story that begins with a financial grievance, Mr. Hastings had misplaced a copy of a film called Apollo 13. By the time he returned it to his local video rental emporium, he was informed that he owed a late fee of $40. Now, $40 in 1997 could buy you a very respectable dinner, a several hundred-mile train ticket, or approximately 3,000 shares of a failing dot-com company. To be charged such a sum for the privilege of holding on to a plastic cassette a few days too long is the sort of insult that would make a saint take up profanity. Hastings didn't just swear, however. He did something far more dangerous. He went for a workout, pondered the subscription model of his local gymnasium, and decided to invent a way to put the neighborhood video store out of its misery. He called it Netflix. The blue and yellow hegemony. To understand the sheer audacity of this move, one must recall the state of home entertainment in 1997. The world was lived under the thumb of a blue and yellow giant called Blockbuster Video. It was a sprawling empire of brightly lit stores that smelled perpetually of stale popcorn, industrial carpet cleaner, and the quiet desperation of a father trying to find a family-friendly film on a Friday night that didn't involve a talking dog. The ritual was always the same. You would drive to the store, wander the aisles like a lost soul in a purgatory of plastic boxes, and eventually settle for a movie you didn't really want to see because the one you did want was out of stock. Then you would engage in a polite but tense negotiation with a teenager behind the counter who possessed the customer service skills of a gargoyle. But the true genius and the true villainy of the model was the late fee. The industry was built on the assumption that the human memory is a leaky bucket. They didn't make their money from you watching the movie. They made it from you forgetting the movie was on top of your television set. It was a business model based on the monetization of procrastination. The shimmering silver saucer. Hastings and his partner, Mark Randolph, realized that the old way of doing things was tethered to a very heavy, very clumsy piece of technology, the VHS tape. A VHS tape is a bulky rectangular brick filled with miles of magnetic ribbon that has a tendency to tangle if you look at it cross-eyed. You cannot easily mail a brick. If you try to stick a VHS tape in a standard envelope, the postal carrier will likely use it as a wheel chock for his truck and send you a bill for the damages. But 1997 was also the year of the DVD, the digital versatile disc. I call it the shimmering silver saucer. It was a marvel of the age, a thin, lightweight wafer of plastic that could hold a 2-hour tragedy, 3 documentaries about penguins, and special features that nobody asked for. The DVD was the secret weapon. It was light enough to be sent through the mail for the price of a single stamp. Hastings and Randolph allegedly tested the theory by mailing a naked DVD to themselves in a standard envelope. When it arrived unbroken, the fate of the neighborhood video store was sealed. They had discovered a way to turn the United States Postal Service into the world's largest projectionist. The Gospel of the Red Envelope. When Netflix launched, it introduced the world to the red envelope. It was a brilliant bit of branding. Most of the mail a person receives is composed of bills, jury duty summonses, and advertisements for miracle weight loss tonics. To see a bright, cheery red envelope peeking out from the pile was like receiving a valentine from a stranger who knew exactly what kind of explosion-filled cinema you preferred. The concept was simple. You went to a website, that invisible library I mentioned earlier, and you created a queue. You told the machine what you wanted to see, and a few days later, it arrived at your door. When you were done, you put it back in the envelope and dropped it in a mailbox. No driving, no wandering aisles, and most importantly, no late fees. I found the no late fees promise to be a masterstroke of psychological warfare. By removing the punishment, Netflix made the act of watching a movie feel like a luxury rather than a race against a ticking clock. They realized that a customer who feels respected, or at least a customer who isn't being fleeced for $40, is a customer who will keep paying you $10 a month until the sun burns out. The death of the rental store argument. Now, as a man who enjoys a good-spirited disagreement, I must confess that I felt a slight pang of sadness for the loss of the late fee argument. There is a certain theatrical quality to standing at a rental counter and passionately lying about how you definitely put the movie in the drop box on Sunday night and that the store's clock must be fast. It's a classic American folk dance of deception and indignant huffing. With Netflix, that human element was gone. If a disc didn't arrive, you simply clicked a button on the screen that said, "Report a problem," and the machine would apologize and send another one. You can't argue with a machine. It has no feelings to hurt and no manager to call. We were trading the community of the rental store, with all its smells and its surly teenagers, for the convenience of the mailbox. We were becoming a race of shut-ins who could summon the entire history of Hollywood without ever putting on a pair of shoes. The algorithm of desire. Netflix also began to do something that I find both impressive and slightly terrifying. It began to recommend things. Based on what you had watched, the machine would suggest other things you might enjoy. Since you enjoyed the adventures of Tom Sawyer, the machine might say, you might also enjoy the great train robbery. I've always maintained that a man's taste is his own business, and the idea that a collection of silicon chips thinks it knows my heart better than I do is a bit of a pill to swallow. What if I want to watch a documentary about the history of the steam engine one night, and a mindless comedy about a man who loses his trousers the next? The machine gets confused. It tries to find a pattern in my madness. But for the rest of the world, this was a revelation. It was the birth of the on-demand lifestyle. We were no longer at the mercy of what the local store happened to have on the shelf. We had a long tail, a library that stretched from the latest blockbusters all the way back to the obscure silent films that even the actors had forgotten they were in. A final toast to the Red Revolution. As 1997 drew to a close, Netflix was still a small underdog operation. Blockbuster didn't even consider them a threat. They viewed them as a quirky, mail-order novelty, like those people who sell sea monkeys in the back of comic books. But I saw the writing on the wall, or rather, I saw the red in the mailbox. The red envelope revolution proved that in the Silicon frontier, friction is the enemy. If you make a thing even 5% easier to do, the human race will beat a path to your door and bring their checkbooks with them. We are a species that will always choose the path of least resistance, especially if that path leads directly to our own sofas. Hastings and Randolph didn't just build a business, they changed the gravity of the home. They made the mailbox the center of the entertainment universe. And while I miss the smell of the popcorn at the old rental store and the occasional joy of a 40-minute argument over a rewind fee, I have to admit that there is something undeniably different about a world where the library comes to you. I just hope the postal carrier doesn't mind that I'm still in my bathrobe when he delivers the latest tragedy. After all, it's 1997, and I have a queue to attend to. Chapter 9. The Titanic's Second Sinking. I have spent a considerable portion of my life upon the water, primarily the Mississippi, a river that has a personality like a temperamental aunt. One moment she is baking you a pie, and the next she is trying to drown you in the cellar. I have seen boats go down. I have seen boilers explode with the enthusiasm of a 4th of July gala. And I have seen the look on a pilot's face when he realizes he has mistaken a sandbar for a deep channel. Consequently, I consider myself something of an expert on the various ways man can make a fool of himself when he attempts to conquer the damp parts of the world. But in December of 1997, a gentleman by the name of James Cameron managed to do something that even the most incompetent riverboat captain could never dream of. He sank the most famous ship in history for a second time, and he made the entire human race pay $10 a head for the privilege of watching it happen in slow motion. The unsinkable budget. Before the film was released, the experts, those delightful vultures I have mentioned before, were already sharpening their talons. They noted that the film had cost $200 million to produce. Now, you must understand the scale of this absurdity. The actual Titanic, the one made of steel and rivets that went to the bottom in 1912, cost about $7.5 million to build. Even if you adjust for the creeping rot of inflation, Mr. Cameron spent more money to simulate the disaster than the White Star Line spent to experience it. The newspapers were calling it Cameron's Folly. They predicted it would be the greatest shipwreck in the history of cinema, a digital disaster that would leave the studio penniless and the director wandering the streets of Hollywood with nothing but a megaphone and a damp script. But they forgot one thing: never underestimate the public's appetite for a tragedy. Provided you include enough lace, a diamond the size of a pigeon's egg, and a handsome lad who looks like he's never had to shave in his life. The Gospel of Leomania. The handsome lad in question was Leonardo DiCaprio. In 1997, you could not walk 10 feet without encountering this young man's face. He was on the covers of magazines. He was on the bedroom walls of every girl between the ages of 12 and 24, and he was likely in the dreams of several family pets. It was a phenomenon the press called Leomania. I have seen mania before. I remember when people went mad for gold in the Klondike, and I remember when they went mad for spiritualism and talking to ghosts. But this was different. This was a collective, global swoon. The boy had a floppy haircut and a look of perpetual, soulful yearning that seemed to suggest he was constantly looking for a lost puppy. In the film, he played Jack Dawson, a penniless artist who wins a ticket on the Titanic in a poker game. As a man who has lost more than a few hands of poker in smoke-filled cabins, I can tell you that winning a ticket on a ship that is about to hit an iceberg is not luck. It is the universe's way of telling you that you should have stayed at the bar. The Romance of the Rust. The plot was a classic high society girl meets low-rent boy affair. Rose, played by Kate Winslet, who possessed a regal sort of beauty that suggested she could survive anything, including a 3-hour movie, is trapped in a stifling engagement to a man named Cal. Cal is the sort of villain I always enjoyed writing. He has a magnificent head of hair, an enormous bank account, and the moral compass of a timber wolf. The two lovers meet. They dance in the steerage hold, which, in the movie, looks remarkably clean and lively, whereas in reality it likely smelled like wet wool and unwashed ambition. And they engage in a bit of artistic expression involving a drawing pad and a complete lack of wardrobe. But the scene that truly captured the world's imagination and nearly caused a global shortage of teenagers standing on the prows of rental boats was the king of the world moment. Jack holds Rose at the very tip of the ship, their arms outstretched as if they are about to fly. It was a beautiful image, though as a former pilot all I could think was, "Get down from there, you idiots! You're obstructing the view of the lookout." The technical triumph of the tragedy. When the iceberg finally arrives, the most predictable guest in the history of theater, the movie shifts from a romance to a mechanical nightmare. And here I must tip my hat to Mr. Cameron. He built a nearly full-scale model of the ship and then proceeded to break it. The digital effects were a revelation. In my day, if you wanted to show a ship sinking, you used a bathtub, a wooden toy, and a lot of imagination. In 1997, they used computers to simulate every splash, every groan of twisting metal, and every unfortunate soul falling into the abyss. There was one fellow, the Propeller Man, the fans called him, who hits a giant brass propeller on his way down with a very audible clink. I found it a bit macabre, but the audience seemed to appreciate the attention to detail. It was a 3-hour spectacle of doom, and yet the theaters were packed. People went back to see it 5, 10, even 15 times. They knew the ship was going to sink. They knew Jack was going to turn into a Leo popsicle. And yet they kept paying their $10. The controversy of the door. Now, I cannot discuss Titanic without addressing the great plywood debate that has raged in every coffee shop and internet chat room since the film's release. At the end of the film, Jack and Rose are in the freezing Atlantic. Rose is lying on a floating piece of wood, a door, I believe, and Jack is treading water beside her until he eventually catches a terminal chill and sinks into the dark. I have looked at that door. I have studied the dimensions of that door. I have calculated the buoyancy of Victorian woodwork, and I tell you this, Jack could have fit on the door. There was plenty of room. If Rose had simply shifted her skirt 6 inches to the left, Jack could have hopped up. They could have shared a pleasant conversation about their future in New York, and the movie would have ended with a nice cup of cocoa. But that wouldn't have been art. Art requires a sacrifice. Art requires a handsome young man to die in the prime of his life so that the audience has a reason to use up an entire box of tissues. Mr. Cameron knew that a happy ending doesn't win 11 Academy Awards. A happy ending doesn't sell 1 billion soundtracks. The song that would not die. Speaking of the soundtrack, we must discuss Celine Dion. She sang a song called My Heart Will Go On. In 1997, this song was not merely a musical composition. It was an atmospheric condition. It was everywhere. It was in the grocery stores. It was in the elevators. It was leaking out of the windows of passing cars. It is a song that starts as a delicate flute melody and eventually builds into a sonic boom of grief and triumph. It was the candle in the wind of the cinema. It was perfectly designed to trigger the tear ducts of anyone with a pulse. I've always said that a heart is a very sturdy organ, but even mine began to wilt after the 4,000th time I heard Ms. Dion hit that high note. It was the auditory equivalent of being hit by a velvet steamroller. The king of the world, officially. In the end, Titanic became the highest-grossing film of all time. It won 11 Oscars. When James Cameron stood on that stage and shouted, "I'm the king of the world," he wasn't just quoting his own movie. He was rubbing it in the faces of every critic who had predicted his ruin. It was a victory for the big story. In an age of cynicism, in a year of OK Computer and paranoid androids, the world decided it wanted something grand, something tragic, and something utterly sincere. We wanted to believe that love could survive a shipwreck, even if the boyfriend couldn't survive a floating door. A pilot's final word. As I look back on 1997, I realize that Titanic was the ultimate metaphor for the human condition. We are all on a grand, glittering ship, draped in our finest clothes, dancing and drinking, and convinced that we are unsinkable. And all the while, the icebergs of reality, the Y2K bugs, the cloning sheep, the machines that play chess, are waiting for us in the dark. We know the ending. We know the ship goes down. But we keep the band playing anyway. We keep falling in love. We keep drawing pictures. And we keep standing on the prow with our arms outstretched, hoping that for just one moment we can feel like the king of the world before the water gets too cold. It's a grand, beautiful, ridiculous humbug. and I wouldn't have it any other way. Chapter 10. The Sound of the Paranoid Android. I have always maintained that if a man cannot express his soul's deepest yearnings with a fiddle, a banjo, and a reasonably sober voice, he ought to give up the arts entirely and take up a sensible profession like grave digging or politics. In my day, music was a straightforward affair. A song was about a girl, a river, a lost dog, or the occasional catastrophic boiler explosion. You knew where the melody was going, and it usually had the decency to arrive there without making a spectacle of itself. But in June of 1997, a group of young Englishmen, collectively known as Radiohead, released an album called OK Computer. I have spent some time listening to this record, mostly because I was told it was the defining masterpiece of the generation, and I have come to the conclusion that the future sounds remarkably like a toaster having an existential crisis in a rainstorm. The anatomy of a Radiohead. First, we must address the name, Radiohead. It sounds like a specialized medical condition one might contract from spending too much time near a telegraph wire or a particularly enthusiastic lightning rod. The leader of this troupe is a fellow named Tom York, a man who sings with a sort of mournful, high-pitched yearning that suggests he has accidentally shut his hand in a car door and has decided to make a career out of the resulting sensation. In 1997, the world was supposed to be happy. We had Spice Girls, as I shall discuss later, may heaven preserve us. We had a booming stock market, and we had computers that could play chess. We were told we were entering a golden age of connectivity, and yet here come these 5 lads from Oxford to tell us that we are all actually miserable, paranoid, and being slowly digested by our own inventions. It is a magnificent humbug to sell millions of records by telling the customers that their lives are hollow and their refrigerators are plotting against them. I tip my hat to them. It's a level of creative pessimism I haven't seen since I looked at my own bank statements in 1894. The anthem of the anxious robot. The centerpiece of this musical calamity is a song called Paranoid Android. Now, I am familiar with paranoia. It is the state of mind one develops when one owes money to a man with a very large collection of legal summonses. And I am becoming familiar with androids, those mechanical men who populate the more feverish dreams of the modern scientist. But a paranoid android? Think of the tragedy of it. To build a machine with the intellect of a god and the nervous system of a high-strung poodle. The song itself is over 6 minutes long and changes direction more often than a politician being asked a direct question about his taxes. It starts with a gentle, acoustic strumming, then descends into a chaotic digital shrieking, and finally ends in a sort of grand operatic weeping. The lyrics mention Gucci little piggies and the dust and the screaming. It is not exactly Suwannee River, but in 1997, this was the anthem of the youth. They didn't want to hear about the sunny side of life. They wanted to hear about the anxiety of the Silicon frontier. They felt like the android, perfectly programmed to succeed, yet utterly terrified that they were about to be replaced by a newer model with more RAM, which I'm told stands for Random Access Memory, though in my case it usually stands for Rare and Meager. The gospel of efficiency, fitter, happier. There is a track on this album called Fitter, Happier. It is not a song in the traditional sense. It features no singing. Instead, a flat, mechanical, computer-generated voice recites a list of instructions for living a perfect modern life. Fitter, happier, more productive, comfortable, not drinking too much, regular exercise at the gym, 3 days a week, getting on better with your associate employee contemporaries. It is the most terrifying thing I have ever heard. It is the sound of a human being trying to turn himself into a piece of office equipment. In my day, if a man tried to be more productive and regularly exercised, we'd assume he was running from the law. We valued a certain amount of unproductiveness. It's where the best stories come from. You can't write Huckleberry Finn if you're busy being fitter and happier and getting on better with your associate employee contemporaries. You need to be a bit ragged, a bit lazy, and a bit suspicious of anyone who tells you to go to a gym. The irony, of course, is that in 1997, everyone was trying to be a machine. We were obsessed with optimization. We wanted faster processors, faster modems, and faster lives. Radiohead simply took that desire and played it back to us through a voice that sounded like a cynical speak and spell. It was a mirror held up to the face of the century, and the reflection was wearing a barcode. The Karma Police and the Great Accountability. Then there is Karma Police. I have always been a believer in karma, the idea that the universe eventually catches up with you and delivers a swift kick to the seat of your trousers for your past transgressions. But the idea of a police force dedicated to this pursuit is a stroke of genius. The song claims that the Karma Police will arrest you for talking in maths or for having a Hitler hairdo. I felt a brief moment of relief that my own hair is more of a startled cloud than a Hitler, though I do occasionally talk in maths when I'm trying to figure out how many cigars I can afford. The song captures that 1997 feeling that we were all being watched, not by the government necessarily, but by the system. The World Wide Web was beginning to remember everything we did. Our credit cards knew what we bought. Our computers knew what we searched for. We were creating a world where karma was no longer a mystical force of the heavens, but a database in a basement in Seattle. The No Surprises Raft. My favorite song on the record? If a man can be said to have a favorite toothache, is No Surprises. It features a tinkling, lullaby-like melody that sounds like a music box in a haunted nursery. It speaks of a job that slowly kills you and bruises that won't heal. The singer asks for no alarms and no surprises. It is the modern version of my raft on the Mississippi. It is a longing for a quiet place where the world can't find you, where the beeping stops, and where you don't have to think different or be productive. In a year of the Titanic and the Pathfinder and the Spice Girls, OK Computer was the sound of a person trying to find an off switch. It was the realization that the future was here, and it was a bit louder and a bit more crowded than we had anticipated. The soundtrack of the fin de siècle. By the end of 1997, you couldn't escape this album. It was playing in every coffee house, those peculiar establishments where people pay $4 for a cup of bean water and then sit in silence, staring at their glowing boxes. It was hailed as the Sgt. Pepper of the 90s. I find it fitting that as we approach the end of the millennium, we chose a soundtrack that was so riddled with doubt. We were like a man standing on the deck of a grand steamer, looking at the magnificent engine room and thinking, "This is a marvel of engineering, but I have a nagging suspicion that the boiler is about to explode, and the captain is actually a collection of vacuum tubes." Radiohead didn't give us answers. They didn't tell us how to fix the paranoid android or how to escape the karma police. They just provided the noises to match our own internal glitches. A final note from the 19th century. As I look at my own mechanical failures, the Page Compositor, for instance, which was a machine so paranoid it would break a piece of type if you looked at it with an unkind expression, I realized that I was a Radiohead fan before the word was invented. I've always known that technology is a jealous god that demands your soul and gives you back a fitter, happier version of yourself that can no longer enjoy a good sunset. So, I will give the lads their due. Okay? Computer is a masterpiece of modern misery. It is the sound of the 20th century realizing it has left the stove on and is now too far away to go back and turn it off. I'm going to go put on a record of some simple, honest banjo music now. My radio head is starting to hurt, and I'm beginning to suspect that my typewriter is judging my spelling. And that, my friends, is a surprise I simply don't need. Chapter 11. The Google Index. I have often contended that the greatest problem with the truth is not its scarcity, but its tendency to hide itself in a pile of particularly enthusiastic lies. In my day, if a man wanted to find a specific fact, say, the population of Constantinople, or the best way to remove a stubborn ink stain from a white linen suit, he had to engage in a physical labor that bordered on the heroic. He had to put on a hat, walk to a library, consult a card catalog that smelled of ancient glue and forgotten dreams, and then wander through the stacks like a prospector in a mountain range made of paper. But in September of 1997, two young scholars at Stanford University, fellows by the names of Larry Page and Sergey Brin, registered a domain name that would effectively put an end to the heroic search and replace it with the digital twitch. They called it Google, the etymology of a burp. Now, let us pause and consider the name. Google. I have made a comfortable living by selecting words with the precision of a jeweler, yet I have never encountered a word that sounds more like a 6-month-old infant trying to explain a stomachache. It is a corruption of Google, a mathematical term for a 1 followed by 100 zeros, a number so large that it makes the national debt of the United States look like a handful of pocket change. But before it was Google, do you know what they called it? They called it back rub. I am not making this up. I have been accused of many stretches in my literary career, but I could never invent a name so profoundly unsettling for a library service. Back rub. It sounds like the sort of thing a suspicious character in a dark alley offers you before he steals your watch. Fortunately, these young men possessed enough sense to realize that while the world might want its information organized, it didn't necessarily want its data massaged by a couple of graduate students in a dorm room. And so, Google was born. A name that was destined to become a verb, a noun, and eventually the official excuse for why nobody can remember their own mother's birthday without the assistance of a silicon chip. The problem of the messy attic. To understand the necessity of Google, one must understand the state of the World Wide Web in 1997. It was a magnificent, chaotic mess. It was an attic that spanned the entire globe, filled with the collective wisdom of the ages, the ramblings of lunatics, and an alarming number of photographs of people's breakfasts. There were search engines already in existence, of course. There was Alta Vista, which sounded like a brand of expensive cigars, and Yahoo, which sounded like a man falling off a cliff. But these services worked like a simple list. They looked for how many times a word appeared on a page. If you searched for the Mississippi River, they would give you a page where a man had written the word Mississippi 500 times, even if he was actually talking about a recipe for mud pie. It was a library where the books were arranged by how loud the covers were, rather than what was inside them. The page rank, the popularity contest of the gods. Page and Brin changed the game with an algorithm, a word that sounds like a rhythmic dance performed by a mathematician, but is actually just a very complicated recipe for sorting things. They called it PageRank. The genius of PageRank was that it treated the World Wide Web like a giant high school. It decided that a page was important not because of what it said, but because of what other people said about it. If 1,000 people linked to your page, you were a senior prom king. If only your mother linked to your page, you were a back rub user. It was a popularity contest conducted by machines. It turned the chaos of the information age into a hierarchy. It meant that for the first time in history, the most useful thing was actually at the top of the pile, rather than buried under a mountain of digital garbage. I find it a bit suspicious, of course. I've always known that popularity is a very poor measure of truth. If we ranked everything by popularity, the world's greatest literature would be composed entirely of limericks about sailors, and our national anthem would be a song about a dancing hamster. But for the purpose of finding the population of Constantinople, the machine proved to be remarkably efficient. The death of the wrong isle. But here is where my skepticism begins to itch like a wool sweater in July. By making the search so efficient, Google began to kill the wrong isle. I have always maintained that the most important discoveries are made when you're looking for something else. You go into a library looking for a book on geology, you get lost in the G section, and you end up discovering a volume on the history of piracy or the secret life of the honeybee. Your mind is expanded by the happy accident. Google prevents the accident. It gives you exactly what you asked for, with the cold, terrifying precision of a tax collector. It doesn't want you to wander. It doesn't want you to browse. It wants you to get the answer and get out. We are becoming a race of people who know exactly where we are going, but have forgotten how to enjoy the scenery on the way there. I worry that if we stop wandering into the wrong aisle, we will eventually stop having wrong ideas, and wrong ideas are the only ones that ever change the world. Every great invention was, at its heart, a wrong idea that refused to die. The Digital Confessional. By the end of 1997, Google was becoming the world's most trusted confidant. People were starting to realize that they could tell the search bar things they would never tell their priest, their lawyer, or their spouse. The search box is the only place on earth where a human being is completely honest. How do I get rid of a rash? Is it legal to keep a raccoon as a butler? Why does my elbow make that clicking sound? We are building a great index of human anxiety. Somewhere in California, There is a machine that knows exactly what the human race is worried about at 3 o'clock in the morning. I find this a bit unsettling. In my day, if you had a clicking elbow, you kept it to yourself and hoped for the best, or you asked a doctor who would tell you to drink more water and give him $5. Now, we ask the machine, and the machine tells us we have 18 different varieties of plague, most of them incurable, and all of them involving expensive medications. The all-knowing humbug. The danger of an all-knowing index is that we eventually start to believe the index is the world. We think that if a thing isn't on the first page of the Google results, it doesn't exist. I've seen this kind of authoritative humbug before. In the 19th century, we had the Encyclopedia Britannica. It was a magnificent collection of leather-bound books that sat on a shelf and pretended to know everything. But even the Britannica had the decency to admit it was written by men who were occasionally wrong, frequently biased, and almost always bored. Google, however, presents its results with a clean, white, mathematical objectivity. It doesn't look like a human wrote it. It looks like the universe itself has spoken. But we must remember that the algorithm is just a reflection of us. It is the collective echo of a billion people searching for cat videos and how to get rich without working. If Google is the mind of God, then God spends an alarming amount of time thinking about celebrity gossip and the price of discount sneakers. A final salute to the card catalog. As 1997 drew to a close, the Google domain was just a small stake in the ground of a new territory. Nobody knew then that it would grow into a sovereign state with its own language, its own maps, and its own way of knowing where you are at all times. I tip my hat to Mr. Page and Mr. Brin. They solved the problem of the messy attic. They gave us a flashlight in the dark. But as I sit here with my pen and my inkwell, I find myself missing the old way. I miss the dust of the library. I miss the librarian who looks at you over her spectacles with a mixture of pity and suspicion. And I miss the glorious, unorganized freedom of not being able to find what I was looking for and finding something much better instead. The world is now indexed. We are categorized. We are ranked. It is a miracle of efficiency and a tragedy for the imagination. And now, if you'll excuse me, I'm going to go see if I can Google the best way to get a raccoon to serve a decent cup of coffee. I have a suspicion the machine won't have the answer, but I'm curious to see if it tries to sell me a raccoon-sized tuxedo anyway. Chapter 12. The Cassini-Huygens Voyage. I have often observed that the human animal is never so restless as when he is perfectly comfortable. Give a man a warm bed, a full stomach, and a roof that doesn't leak more than is strictly necessary for ventilation, and within 48 hours he will be staring out the window, wondering what the neighbors are having for dinner, and whether the moon is made of green cheese or merely of very high-quality granite. We are a species of cosmic busybodies. We cannot see a "keep out" sign on the door of the universe without immediately looking for a crowbar and a way to peek through the keyhole. In October of 1997, this celestial voyeurism reached a new peak of expensive absurdity. While the rest of the world was busy arguing over the lyrics to "Candle in the Wind," or trying to figure out if their computer would explode at the stroke of midnight in the year 2000, A group of scientists, men who possess the quiet, terrifying patience of people who actually understand logarithms, launched a machine called Cassini-Huygens. Its destination? Saturn. Now, Saturn is not exactly in the next county. It is nearly 1 billion miles away. To put that in perspective for the common man, if you were to board a Mississippi steamboat and head for Saturn at a respectable clip, you would not only run out of wood for the boiler, but you would likely be dead for several centuries before you even passed the orbit of Mars. It is a distance that makes far seem like an understatement, and infinity seem like a reasonable neighborhood. The 7-year itch of the stars. The first thing that strikes me about this mission is the sheer, unadulterated waiting involved. We live in an age of instant gratification. As I have noted, we have fast food, express mail, and instant search. If a man has to wait more than 30 seconds for his toast to pop up, he begins to contemplate a lawsuit against the manufacturer. And yet, here is a project where the scientists said, "We shall launch this $3 billion bucket of bolts today, and with any luck, we might see a photograph of a ring in 7 years." 7 years! In 7 years, a man can get married, raise a child to the age of reason, lose his hair, and fail at 3 different careers. But these space fellows have a different clock. They are content to send their mechanical child into the dark, knowing it won't even arrive at its destination until the next century. It is the ultimate long-term investment. It is like planting an acorn and hoping your great-grandchildren will enjoy the shade, except the acorn costs more than the entire state of Rhode Island and is currently traveling at 60,000 miles an hour. The gravity of the situation. How does one get a machine to Saturn? You might think you just pointed at the big yellow dot and pull the trigger, but space, I am told, is not a straight line. It is a series of curves and slingshots. Because we didn't have a rocket big enough to push Cassini all the way there, man's ambition always being slightly larger than his actual hardware, we had to use gravity assists. This is a fancy scientific term for interplanetary hitchhiking. The probe had to fly past Venus twice, then Earth, and then Jupiter, using the gravity of those planets to whip it faster and faster into the void. I find this remarkably clever and fundamentally dishonest. It's the celestial equivalent of a man who goes for a walk, grabs onto the bumper of a passing carriage to save his legs, and then tells everyone he pioneered the route. We are stealing energy from the planets just to get a better look at their neighbor. I half expected Venus to send us a bill for the wear and tear on her gravitational pull. The mothership and the European hitchhiker. The machine itself was a 2-part contraption. There was Cassini, the mothership, named after a fellow who discovered gaps in Saturn's rings back when I was still a glimmer in my father's eye, and attached to her side like a nervous barnacle was Huygens, a smaller probe built by the Europeans. The division of labor was quite clear. Cassini was to stay in orbit and take the pictures, while Huygens was designed to do the dirty work. Specifically, it was meant to detach itself and dive headfirst into the atmosphere of Titan, Saturn's largest moon. Titan is a place that sounds like a nightmare dreamed up by a chemist with a grudge. It is covered in a thick orange haze of methane and nitrogen. It has lakes of liquid gas and temperatures so cold that a brass monkey would not only lose his particulars, but would likely shatter into 1 billion pieces of frozen metal upon contact. Why would we want to land a probe there? Because the scientists believe Titan looks like a deep freeze version of the early Earth. They want to see if life could start in a place that smells like a leaky stove and feels like the inside of a block of ice. It's a curious human trait. We spend billions to find life in a frozen swamp 1 billion miles away. Yet we won't speak to the fellow living in the apartment next door because he plays his radio too loud. The $3 billion ringmaster. We must discuss the cost. $3 billion. Now, I have seen a lot of money wasted in my time. I have seen governments spend fortunes on wars that solve nothing, and I have personally spent a fortune on a typesetting machine that could do everything except work. But $3 billion to look at a few rings of ice and dust is a humbug of the highest order. For $3 billion, you could buy enough cigars to keep me happy until the sun goes out. You could pave the Mississippi with silver. You could buy every politician in Washington and still have enough left over to purchase a respectable number of cardinals in Rome. But what do we get for our $3 billion? We get knowledge. Knowledge is the only commodity that is always overpriced and yet always worth the cost. We want to know if the rings are solid or if they are just 1 billion icy snowballs playing a game of celestial bumper cars. We want to know if Saturn is still growing. We want to know our place in the grand, terrifying clockwork of the stars. I've always said that the man who does not use his brain has no advantage over the man who does not have one. And Cassini-Huygens is the ultimate brain user. It is a testament to our refusal to be small. We are tiny creatures living on a damp blue marble, yet we have the brass to reach out across 1 billion miles of silence and say, "Tag, you're it," to a giant ball of gas. The loneliness of the long-distance robot. There is a certain dignity to a space probe. Unlike a human explorer, a probe doesn't complain about the food. It doesn't get homesick. It doesn't write letters to the editor about the lack of amenities in the vacuum of space. It simply does its job, year after year, hurtling through the dark, sending back a steady stream of beeps and bloops that translate into the most beautiful photographs ever seen by human eyes. I think of Cassini out there tonight, somewhere past Jupiter, a lonely spark in the immense blackness. It is the frontier scout of the 20th century. It is the Lewis and Clark of the stars, but without the mosquitoes and the blisters. In 1997, as the world grew smaller and more connected via the glowing boxes and the Google indexes, Cassini was the reminder that the world is actually quite large. It was a reminder that while we are busy searching for things on our little screens, there is a whole universe out there that doesn't care about our URLs or our late fees. A final toast to the Voyager. When Cassini finally reached Saturn in 2004, a date that seemed as far away in 1997 as the end of time, it sent back images that would make a poet weep and a mathematician reconsider his career. It showed us the hexagon on the North Pole, the moon that looks like a walnut, and the rings that are as thin as a sheet of paper, yet wider than the distance from the Earth to the moon. But in 1997, it was just a dream on top of a rocket. It was a salute to the future. I find it fitting that as we entered the silicon frontier, we sent a piece of silicon to the furthest reaches of the solar system. We are casting our bread upon the celestial waters, hoping it will come back as a loaf of understanding. I hope the machine likes the view. It's a long way to go for a look, but as I've always maintained, the only thing more expensive than an education is ignorance. And for $3 billion, I expect Saturn to put on a show that would make P.T. Barnum retire in shame. And now, if you'll excuse me, thinking about 1,000,000,000 miles has made my feet hurt. I'm going to go find a chair that is firmly attached to the ground and a beverage that isn't currently traveling at 60,000 miles an hour. Chapter 13. The Spice World Invasion. I have spent a great deal of my life studying the various fevers that afflict the human race. I have seen the gold fever that turned sensible men into raving lunatics in the frozen gulches of the Klondike. I have seen the spiritualist fever, where people paid $2 to hear a table leg tap out messages from their departed Aunt Martha. And I have seen the political fever, which occurs every 4 years and results in a temporary suspension of all known laws of logic and decency. But in 1997, I bore witness to a psychological contagion that made the Black Death look like a mild case of the sniffles. I am speaking, of course, of the Spice Girls. They were 5 young women from England who arrived on the shores of the American consciousness with the subtlety of a steamboat explosion in a quiet harbor. They didn't just sing songs, they manifested a destiny. They were a 5-headed hydra of platform shoes, leopard print, and a battle cry that echoed through every shopping mall from Maine to Missouri. Girl power. The 5 pillars of the pop apocalypse. Now, as a man who appreciates a good character sketch, I must admit that the Spice branding was a masterpiece of Victorian-level archetyping. In my day, if you wanted to sell a story, you gave the audience a hero, a villain, a damsel, and a fool. The Spice Girls simply updated the roster for the Silicon Frontier. They divided the female experience into 5 distinct, easily digestible categories, much like a restaurant menu or a catalog of livestock. First, there was Scary Spice. I found her name to be a bit of a misnomer. In my experience, a scary person is a debt collector with a legal summons or a river pilot who doesn't know where the snags are. This young lady simply possessed a very loud voice and a head of hair that looked like it was attempting to escape her skull in several directions at once. Then there was Sporty Spice. She spent the entirety of 1997 in a tracksuit, performing backflips and high kicks as if she were perpetually 30 seconds late for a gymnastics meet that never actually took place. She represented the idea that a woman could be both one of the lads and also capable of kicking your teeth in if you touched her boombox. Thirdly, we had Baby Spice. She wore pigtails, carried a lollipop, and dressed in shades of pink that would make a sunset blush with embarrassment. She was a grown woman who had convinced the world that infantilism was a viable political platform. It was a magnificent piece of humbug. She looked like she belonged in a nursery, yet she was making more money in a week than most Victorian industrial magnates made in a lifetime. Then there was Posh Spice. She was the aristocrat of the group. She rarely smiled, presumably because she was worried it might cause a wrinkle in her very expensive, very small black dress. She possessed the icy, detached gaze of a duchess who has just discovered a caterpillar in her salad. And finally, Ginger Spice. She was the firebrand. She wore a dress made out of a Union Jack flag, a garment that in 1897 would have gotten her arrested for treason, or at least a very stern talking to by a bishop. In 1997, it simply made her the unofficial mascot of Cool Britannia, the philosophy of the leopard print. The mantra they preached was girl power. I have pondered this phrase deeply. At first, I thought it might be a new form of energy like steam power or electricity, perhaps a way to run a cotton mill using only the collective enthusiasm of teenage girls. But I soon realized it was something far more potent. It was a marketing engine. Girl power meant that you could do anything, be anything, and buy anything provided it had a Spice logo on it. It was the think different of the nursery. It told a generation of young women that they didn't need to wait for a Prince Charming to rescue them. They could rescue themselves, and then they could buy the prince's castle and turn it into a discotheque. It was a brilliant stroke of commercial genius. By wrapping the pursuit of global pop culture domination in a cloak of empowerment, they made it impossible to criticize them without sounding like a grumpy old man who hates progress, which, to be fair, is a role I play with great relish. But even I have to admire a well-executed grift. The Spice World Cinematic Calamity. The fever reached its boiling point with the production and release of their movie Spice World. Now, I have written plays and I have seen dramas that lasted 5 acts and involved 3 suicides and a ghost. But Spice World was a different breed of theater. It was a movie about the Spice Girls being the Spice Girls while riding around London in a double-decker bus that was larger on the inside than the outside, a piece of magical realism that I suspect was stolen from a certain boy with a lightning bolt on his forehead. The plot, as far as I could tell, involved a great deal of shouting, several costume changes, and an alien encounter. Yes, aliens. Apparently, the spice phenomenon was so vast that even the inhabitants of the Andromeda Galaxy felt the need to stop by and ask for an autograph. It was a film that defied every law of narrative structure. It didn't have a beginning, middle, or end. It simply had segments. It was a 90-minute commercial for itself. And yet, the public flocked to it. They didn't go for the acting, which was performed with the wooden sincerity of a cigar store Indian. They went for the vibe. They went to be part of the invasion. The merchandising of the soul. In 1997, the Spice Girls were not just humans. They were a consumable product. You could buy Spice Girls lollipops. You could buy Spice Girls deodorant. You could buy Spice Girls cameras, dolls, and, for all I know, Spice Girls brand anthracite coal for your winter stove. They were the first group to realize that a band was merely a front for a global conglomerate. I watched as the Silicon Frontier and the Spice Frontier merged. These girls used the World Wide Web to spread their message of zigga zigga, a phrase that I have spent 3 months trying to translate and have concluded is either a profound Zen koan or the sound a person makes when they're choking on a biscuit. They were viral before we had a word for it. They were a digital infection that moved through the phone lines and the television screens, turning every household into a satellite office of Spice Global, the great British export. There is a delicious irony in the fact that exactly 100 years after the British Empire celebrated its Diamond Jubilee in 1897, a grand, somber affair of soldiers and steamships, it sent out this neon-colored expeditionary force in 1997. The British had lost Hong Kong, as I noted in Chapter 4, but they had conquered the Billboard charts. They had traded their gunboat diplomacy for girl power diplomacy. And honestly, the spice version was much more effective. A gunboat can only threaten a harbor. A catchy pop song can occupy the brain of an 11-year-old girl for 6 months, dictating her wardrobe, her vocabulary, and her parents' credit card balance. A raft versus a bus. As I look back on the Spice World invasion, I find myself feeling a bit like a man standing on a quiet riverbank watching a parade of steam whistles and fireworks go by. It's loud, it's colorful, and it's undeniably impressive, but I can't help but wonder what happens when the fuel runs out. The Spice Girls told us to tell them what we want, what we really, really want. Well, what I really, really want is a quiet night on a raft on the Mississippi, where the only scary thing is a distant owl and the only sporty thing is the occasional leap of a catfish. I find the modern world's obsession with poshness and gingerness to be exhausting. But I am in the minority. In 1997, the world wanted the noise. It wanted the neon. It wanted to believe that if it just spiced up its life, all the anxieties of the OK computer and the Y2K bug would simply dance away. The aftermath of the fever. By the end of the year, the fever was starting to break. Gingered Spice would eventually depart the group, causing a national day of mourning in the UK that rivaled the fall of the Roman Empire. And the girls would eventually go their separate ways to pursue careers in fashion, reality television, and, in one case, marrying a soccer player who spends a great deal of time in his underwear. But they left their mark. They proved that in the Silicon frontier, branding is king. They showed us that you don't need a philosopher's stone to turn lead into gold. You just need a catchy hook, a bit of attitude, and a very good lawyer. I tip my hat to them from one humbug to another. They took the world for a ride in a Union Jack bus. And they didn't even ask for the late fee. And now, if you'll excuse me, I'm going to go see if I can get wannabe out of my head. I've been humming it for 3 hours, and I'm starting to worry that my radio head is becoming a spice head, which is a medical condition I am not prepared to handle at my age. Chapter 14. The 56K Modem Scream. I have always been a man who appreciates the telegraph. There is a dignity to a telegram. It arrives with a certain crispness, a series of staccato taps that suggest the sender has paid by the word, and therefore has no time for unnecessary adjectives or polite inquiries into the health of one's parakeet. It is a silent messenger, a bolt of man-made lightning that travels across the wires with the quiet efficiency of a ghost. But in 1997, the World Wide Web decided that silence was no longer fashionable. If you wanted to visit the great digital library, you had to perform a ritual that sounded less like a technological advancement and more like a mechanical exorcism. I am speaking, of course, of the arrival of the 56K modem, the song of the digital banshee. Before you could see a single pixel of a photograph of a cat in a hat, you had to initiate a handshake. Now, a human handshake is a polite, silent gesture of mutual respect. A computer handshake, however, is a cacophony of electronic agony. I have spent some time attempting to transcribe the sound of a 1997 modem connecting to the internet, and the best I can offer is this. Imagine a robotic cat being pulled through a keyhole by a very frustrated vacuum cleaner, while a choir of digital cicadas screams at a pitch that can only be heard by dogs and people who owe money to the bank. It was a series of bongs, hisses, and high-pitched squeals that seemed to say, "I am currently attempting to turn your copper telephone wire into a highway for the collective consciousness of the human race, and it hurts me more than it hurts you." It was a sound that filled the house, alerting everyone, from your grandmother in the kitchen to the burglar in the bushes, that you were about to spend the next 4 hours doing absolutely nothing of any practical value. It was the frontier spirit in digital form, loud, obnoxious, and perpetually on the verge of a nervous breakdown. The 56K Mirage, speed for the patient. In 1997, the 56K standard was hailed as the pinnacle of human achievement. We were told that this was the broadband of the future. I have noticed that the future is always arriving, yet it always seems to need a faster connection once it gets here. The reality of 56K, however, was a bit like being told you've been given a thoroughbred racing horse, only to discover that the horse is actually a very large turtle wearing a festive hat. The promise: you can download a high-resolution photograph in under 3 minutes. The reality: you can watch a photograph of a sunset appear on your screen one horizontal line at a time, like a window shade being pulled up by a person with a severe case of arthritic hesitation. By the time the bottom of the picture arrived, you had usually forgotten why you wanted to see the top of it. I've watched grass grow in the Mississippi mud that moved with more bandwidth than a 1997 modem trying to load a web page filled with animated GIFs, which are small, repetitive moving pictures that serve no purpose other than to make the viewer feel as though they are having a very mild stroke. The domestic civil war, the phone line siege. But the true genius and the true cruelty of the 56K era was that it shared the telephone line. In 1997, a household typically possessed one phone line. This was a single copper thread that connected the family to the outside world. If you were online, you were effectively dead to the world of voice communication. If your Aunt Martha tried to call to tell you that the neighbor's barn had burnt down, she was met with a busy signal, a rhythmic, repetitive honking that is the auditory equivalent of a "keep out" sign. This led to a new kind of domestic warfare. The teenager wants to stay online until 3 a.m. to chat with strangers about the Spice Girls. The mother wants to use the phone to actually speak to a human being about the price of eggs. The result: a house filled with shouting, slammed doors, and the frequent heart-stopping sound of someone picking up the kitchen extension, which would instantly break the internet connection and send the teenager into a fit of Shakespearean despair. I've always said that the telephone is a tool of the devil, but in 1997, it became a tool of domestic sabotage. There is no fury like a person who has spent 45 minutes downloading a program only to have it vanish into the ether because their father wanted to check the scores of the baseball game. The worldwide wait. We called it the information superhighway, but in 1997 it felt more like a dirt road after a heavy rain. We spent more time looking at the hourglass icon, a little digital symbol that tells you to sit still and contemplate your mortality, than we did actually reading information. I found it fascinating. We are the only species that will build a machine to save time and then spend all the saved time staring at the machine, waiting for it to do something. The 56K modem taught us a new kind of digital patience. It forced us to slow down. If you wanted to read a news story from London, you had to commit to it. You couldn't just click and flick like the modern youth. You had to initiate the handshake, wait for the hiss, wait for the page to load, and then, if the wind was blowing in the right direction, you might get to read the headline before the connection timed out. It was a primitive age. We were pioneers in bathrobes navigating a wilderness of HTML and Java, which I am told is a programming language and not, as I had hoped, a fresh pot of coffee. The psychology of the handshake. Why did we endure the scream? Why did we tolerate the busy signals and the turtle-like speeds? Because the 56K modem gave us the illusion of everywhere. For the first time, a man in a small town in Missouri could visit a museum in Paris, shop for a book in Seattle, and argue with a man in Tokyo, all without leaving his armchair. It didn't matter that it was slow, it mattered that it was possible. In 1897, if I wanted to talk to a man in Tokyo, I had to write a letter, put it on a boat, and wait 6 months for a reply that likely said, "I don't understand your handwriting." In 1997, I could send an electronic mail and get a reply in 10 minutes, provided I didn't mind the robotic cat screaming in my ear for the first 2 of those minutes. The 56K modem was the bridge between the physical world and the digital world. It was the sound of the 20th century trying to squeeze itself through a straw. The death of the busy signal. As the year drew to a close, talk began of ISDN and DSL and cable modems, technologies that promised to be always on and silent. I look upon the impending silence with a bit of nostalgia. There was something honest about the modem scream. It reminded you that you were doing something difficult. It reminded you that connectivity isn't free. It requires a sacrifice of noise and a busy phone line. Today, the Internet is silent. It is invisible. It is everywhere, like the air or the tax collector. We forget it's there until it stops working, at which point we behave like infants who have had their rattles stolen. But I will always remember 1997 for the scream. It was the anthem of the Silicon Frontier. It was the sound of a world that was online, on demand, and on edge, trying desperately to find a way to talk to itself without having to use a stamp. And if you'll excuse me, I hear the distinct sound of a busy signal coming from the parlor, which means someone is either trying to download a picture of a comet or Aunt Martha is trying to tell me about the barn again. Either way, I suspect I'm not going to get a dial tone until at least Tuesday. Chapter 15. The Urban Chaos of GTA. I have always maintained that if you want to find the true character of a man, you don't look at how he behaves in a cathedral or a counting house. You look at how he behaves when he thinks nobody is watching and there are no immediate consequences for his soul. In my day, if a fellow wanted to engage in a bit of reprehensible conduct, say stealing a horse, rigging a card game, or accidentally on purpose setting fire to a rival's haystack, he had to possess a certain amount of physical gumption and a willingness to face a very real, very hempen noose. Being a scoundrel was a high-stakes profession that required a sturdy constitution and a fast horse. But in October of 1997, a group of young Scotsmen, who clearly spent more time in dark rooms than is healthy for a growing boy, released a video game called Grand Theft Auto. This game allowed a person to sit in a comfortable armchair, nibble on a digestive biscuit, and systematically violate every known law of God and man across 3 fictional cities, all through the medium of a glowing television screen. It was a digital school for scoundrels, and it caused more weeping and gnashing of teeth among the moral guardians of the age than a Sunday school teacher finding a deck of cards in a pulpit. The bird's-eye view of larceny. Now, I have seen video games before. Most of them involve a small, pixelated Italian gentleman jumping over mushrooms or a yellow circle eating dots in a maze while being chased by colorful ghosts. They were whimsical, innocent, and possessed the intellectual depth of a puddle in a drought. But Grand Theft Auto was different. To begin with, the perspective was top-down. You looked at the world from the heavens, like a bird with a very dark sense of humor and a criminal record. Below, you were tiny streets, tiny cars, and tiny people, whom the game's creators referred to as pedestrians, but whom the players quickly identified as targets. The goal of the game, as far as I could gather, was to commit crimes for profit. You answered payphones, those strange iron sentinels of the 1997 street corner, and received instructions from various unsavory characters to steal cars, transport contraband, and occasionally neutralize a rival. It was a simulation of a life I had only seen in the more colorful parts of the Barbary Coast, but without the smell of salt air and the risk of contracting scurvy. The Great Moral Panic of '97. Naturally, the Aunt Pollys of the world went into an absolute frenzy. Politicians, bishops, and people who write very long letters to the editor in green ink declared that this game would be the final blow to the moral fiber of the youth. They claimed that after 30 minutes of stealing a digital car made of 32 squares of color, a young man would immediately rush out into the street, toss a real driver out of a real Ford Taurus, and embark on a cross-country crime spree. I find this brand of logic to be a magnificent humbug. It is the same argument that was used against dime novels, against the theater, and against my own Huckleberry Finn. They believe that the human imagination is a direct conduit to the hands, and that if a boy reads about a boy on a raft, he will immediately abandon his chores and float to Cairo. To be fair, many did, but that's beside the point. The truth is, humans have always had a dark room in their hearts. We have always enjoyed the thrill of the forbidden. We spent centuries watching tragedies in theaters where everybody gets stabbed in the final act, yet we didn't see a massive uptick in stage dagger sales. The video game was simply a new way to scratch that old itch, a way to be a scoundrel without the inconvenience of a prison sentence or the social awkwardness of being shot by a sheriff. The Garanga Glee. One of the more peculiar features of the 1997 version of the game involved a line of orange-clad monks. If the player managed to run over the entire line of monks with a stolen vehicle, the screen would flash the word Guranga and award a bonus. Now, I have met monks. They are generally a quiet, unassuming lot who spend their time praying and making very high-quality cheeses. To turn their digital demise into a point-scoring opportunity is a level of absurdity that is almost poetic. It is so clearly ridiculous that only a person with no sense of humor or a politician looking for a re-election platform could take it seriously. It was a joke aimed at the very idea of consequence. In the world of Grand Theft Auto, the only sin is being too slow or failing to escape the police, who chased you with a persistence that was almost touching. The Clifford humbug. I later learned that much of the outrage surrounding the game was actually bought and paid for. The creators had hired a publicist named Max Clifford, a man who understood the marketing of scandal better than a snake oil salesman understands a crowded market square. Clifford intentionally stoked the fires of the moral panic. He wanted the bishops to complain. He wanted the politicians to call for a ban. He knew that there is no advertisement in the world so effective as a "do not enter" sign. Tell a young man that a game is dangerous and corrupting, and he will crawl over broken glass to get his hands on a copy. It was a brilliant piece of 1997 theater. The establishment played their roles perfectly, huffing and puffing with indignant rage, while the youth lined up to pay their $40 for the privilege of being corrupted. By the time the game was released, it was already a legend. The sandbox of the soul. The reason Grand Theft Auto became such a phenomenon, I think, is that it was the first sandbox game. In most games, you are on a track. You must go from point A to point B, and you must do exactly what the machine tells you to do. But in GTA, you could just wander. You could ignore the missions entirely. You could find a nice, fast car, drive it to the top of a hill, and watch the tiny digital sun set over a tiny digital harbor. You had freedom. And what do humans do when they are given total freedom in a world where nobody knows their name? They behave like terrors. They drive on the sidewalk. They pick fights with digital policemen. They see if they can jump a car over a bridge. It proves my theory that civilization is merely a thin coat of paint over a very ornery barn. We follow the rules because we have to, not because we want to. Give us a world where the reset button exists, and we will reveal ourselves to be the glorious, chaotic, and occasionally guranga-ing mess that we truly are. The digital frontier. In 1897, the frontier was closing. The wild places were being fenced in, the outlaws were being put in museums, and the world was becoming respectable. In 1997, we opened a new frontier, the Silicon Frontier. We created cities where the law didn't apply, where the cars were infinite, and where you could be a king of the world one minute and a wasted smudge on the pavement the next. I watched the children of 1997 hunched over their controllers, their eyes glazed with the flickering light of the urban chaos. They weren't becoming criminals. They were becoming simulators. They were exploring the dark corners of their own minds from the safety of their bedrooms. And as an old river pilot, I have to admit, there is a certain charm to it. I've often wished I could have steered a steamboat through a crowded harbor at full tilt just to see what would happen, without having to deal with the inevitable inquiry and the loss of my license. Grand Theft Auto gave every man that chance. It was the red envelope revolution of delinquency. A final judgment. So, was it the end of morality? Hardly. The human race has survived much worse than a top-down game about car thieves. We survived the Inquisition, the Crusades, and the invention of the accordion. we will survive the GTA. In fact, I suspect that in 100 years, people will look back at the 1997 version of Grand Theft Auto and find it remarkably quaint. They will see those tiny pixelated cars and those little orange monks and wonder what all the fuss was about. They will probably be playing a game where they can simulate an entire lifetime as a corrupt emperor of a distant galaxy. And they will think of 1997 as a simpler, more innocent time, when all you had to worry about was a digital policeman with a whistle. I'm going to go see if I can figure out how to steal a digital steamboat now. I have a suspicion that if I can get it up to full speed and hit a sandbar, the screen might flash Guranga, and I'll finally get the score I deserve. Chapter 16, The Cloning Ethics Debate. I have often observed that the great author of this universe possesses a remarkably consistent sense of irony. For thousands of years, man has been instructed to be fruitful and multiply, a directive that the human race has followed with such unbridled enthusiasm that we have managed to clutter every corner of the globe with our noisy, hungry, and perpetually dissatisfied progeny. We have relied on the old-fashioned, time-honored methods of biology, methods that involve a certain amount of romance, a fair bit of mystery, and a great deal of biological luck. But in February of 1997, a group of scientists in Scotland, a land previously known primarily for its excellent whiskey and its ability to make a garment out of a picnic blanket, announced to a stunned world that they had found a way to bypass the mystery entirely. They introduced us to Dolly, a Finn Dorset sheep who looked like any other woolly ruminant you might encounter on a hillside, but who possessed a secret that shook the very foundations of human ethics. She was a clone, the Xerox of the barnyard. Now, to the layman, the word cloning sounds like something out of a penny dreadful or a particularly feverish dream by Mary Shelley. We imagine a laboratory filled with bubbling vats, crackling lightning, and a man with a wild eye shouting, "It's alive!" The reality, however, was much more clinical and, in a way, much more terrifying. The scientists at the Roslin Institute didn't use lightning. They used a needle. They took a single cell from the mammary gland of a 6-year-old ewe, essentially a bit of biological scrap, and through a process called somatic cell nuclear transfer, they convinced that cell it was an infant again. They wiped its memory, so to speak, and told it to start over. The result was a sheep that was a perfect genetic carbon copy of its mother. Dolly had no father. She had no biological history that wasn't already written in the cells of another animal. She was a Xerox of a sheep. I find this to be a magnificent bit of scientific brass. For centuries, we have been told that every creature is a unique, one-of-a-kind creation, a special snowflake in the blizzard of existence, and then along comes a man with a microscope to tell us that we are actually just a collection of instructions that can be copied, pasted, and reprinted as many times as the budget allows. The great moral panic of the double. The announcement of Dolly's existence triggered a global moral earthquake. The experts and the ethicists, those people whose job it is to worry professionally about things that haven't happened yet, immediately skipped past the sheep and went straight to the human. If we can clone a sheep, they cried, we can clone a king, we can clone a pope, we can clone a tax collector. Though why anyone would want 2 tax collectors is a mystery that even the most advanced science cannot solve. The newspapers were filled with terrifying visions of the future. They predicted armies of identical soldiers who wouldn't feel pain. They predicted spare parts warehouses where wealthy men kept a younger version of themselves in a basement, ready to provide a new kidney or a fresh head of hair whenever the original started to wear out. I sat back in my chair and laughed. Humans are so predictably vain. We assume that if we copy the hardware, the bones, the blood, and the floppy ears, we have also copied the software, the soul, the wit, and the tendency to forget where we put our spectacles. I've always said that a man is more than the sum of his parts. You could take a cell from my own ear and create a Mark Twain that looks exactly like me. He would have the white suit, the unruly hair, and the magnificent mustache. But would he have my memories? Would he have the particular sting of my childhood failures or the warmth of a sunset on the Mississippi? Would he have my debts? If he would, I'd be happy to let him take over the business immediately. A clone is not a reincarnation. It is a twin who happens to be 30 years younger than you. It is a biological echo, not a new performance. The legal nightmare of the self. The legal profession, upon hearing of Dolly, immediately began to salivate. The possibilities for litigation were truly infinite. If I clone myself, am I my own father? Is my clone my brother, my son, or a very complicated form of personal property? If my clone commits a crime, can I be arrested for premeditated biology? Most importantly, who gets the royalties for my books? In 1997, the United States government, under President Clinton, rushed to ban the use of federal funds for human cloning. They treated the idea as if it were a digital virus that could infect the human soul. They wanted to protect the dignity of the individual. I find dignity to be an amusing word coming from a government. Usually, they only worry about your dignity when they're trying to find a new way to tax it. But the panic was real. We were terrified that we were playing God, which is a game that humans have been trying to play since the first man discovered he could make fire, though we usually end up just burning our own fingers. The vanity of the original. The debate over cloning revealed a deep, dark secret about the human race. We are obsessed with being original. We spend our lives trying to prove that we are unique. We wear different clothes, we cultivate different opinions, and we buy limited edition watches to prove that we are not like the common herd. The idea that we could be reduced to a recipe that can be duplicated at will is a blow to our collective ego that we simply cannot bear. But look at the world around us. In 1997, we were already cloning everything except our bodies. We were watching the same movies in 10,000 different theaters. We were eating the same fast food burgers from Maine to California. We were listening to the same Spice Girls songs on 1 billion identical plastic discs. We live in a world of mass production, yet we are horrified by the idea of a mass-produced human. We are happy to have 1 million identical iMacs, but the idea of 2 identical Aunt Marthas sends us into a cold sweat. It's a curious double standard. We want our technology to be consistent, but we want our humanity to be messy, unpredictable, and authentic, even if that authenticity is just something we bought at a store. The fate of the sheep. As for Dolly herself, she became the most famous you in history. She appeared on the covers of magazines, she was discussed in the halls of Congress, and she likely received more fan mail than the average senator. She spent her days at the Roslin Institute, eating grass and looking remarkably unconcerned about the fact that she was a scientific abomination and a threat to the order of nature. She eventually gave birth to several lambs the old-fashioned way, proving that even a clone prefers the tried-and-true methods of the past to the sterile precision of the laboratory. She lived until 2003, when she was put to rest after developing a lung disease. The critics immediately shouted, "See, clones don't last, they age faster, they are cursed." Perhaps. Or perhaps being the most famous sheep in the world is simply a very stressful occupation. I've always found that the more people look at you, the faster you tend to wear out. A final reflection on the needle. As I look back on the cloning ethics debate of 1997, I see a world that was terrified of its own cleverness. We had found the key to the library of life, and we were horrified to discover that the books were written in a language we could copy, but couldn't yet understand. We spent billions to copy a sheep, yet we still haven't figured out how to keep the originals from killing each other over a bit of dirt in the desert or a difference in their operating systems. We are a race of master copyists who have forgotten how to write a new story. I am not worried about a clone army. I am not worried about a world filled with identical Mark Twains, though the fashion industry would certainly benefit from the sudden demand for white linen suits. I am worried that by focusing so much on the biology of the being, we are forgetting the character of the man. You can clone my DNA, but you cannot clone my gumption. You can duplicate my cells, but you cannot duplicate the truth of my life, which, as I have always maintained, is usually a well-constructed lie designed to make the world a bit more bearable. The Silicon Frontier gave us the ability to copy the world. Now, we just have to figure out if the world is actually worth having two of. And now, if you'll excuse me, I'm going to go look in the mirror. I have a nagging suspicion that I'm looking a bit low resolution today, and I want to make sure I haven't been replaced by a younger model with a faster processor and a less interesting sense of humor. Chapter 17. The Digital Versatile Disc. I have spent a significant portion of my life attempting to preserve the human experience in ink, a medium that possesses the admirable quality of staying exactly where you put it, provided you don't drop the manuscript in a puddle or leave it near a particularly hungry goat. In the 19th century, if a man wanted to see a drama, he had to put on a starched collar, travel to a theater, and sit in a room filled with the scent of unwashed wool and orange peels. If he missed the performance, it was gone, vanished into the ether of memory, leaving nothing behind but a lingering sense of regret and a discarded ticket stub. But in 1997, the world decided that the home theater was no longer a luxury for the Vanderbilts, but a right for every man with a television set and a steady enough hand to handle a shimmering silver wafer called the DVD. The death of the black brick. To understand the triumph of the digital versatile disc, one must first reflect upon the primitive brutality of the VHS tape. For 20 years, we lived under the tyranny of the black plastic brick. A VHS tape was a clumsy contraption filled with miles of magnetic ribbon that had a temperament more volatile than a Missouri mule in a thunderstorm. If you wanted to see a particular scene, you had to fast forward, a process that involved the machine making a sound like a small jet engine struggling to take off. If you wanted to see it again, you had to rewind, which took even longer and seemed to physically exhaust the VCR. And heaven help you if the machine decided it was hungry. I have seen many a fine film reduced to a tangled mess of crinkled brown tape, pulled from the bowels of a player like a ribbon of bad news. Furthermore, there was the tracking. In 1997, we were still plagued by tracking errors, those horizontal lines of static that looked like a blizzard was occurring in the middle of a drawing-room comedy. You had to stand by the machine and fiddle with a little knob, squinting at the screen until the snow cleared, only for it to return the moment you sat back down. It was a technology that required constant mechanical chaperoning. The shimmering wafer. Then came the DVD. It was thin. It was light. It looked like a musical CD that had been to a finishing school and come back with a higher education. The scientists told us it used lasers. Now, I have always been suspicious of lasers. Anything that can both perform delicate eye surgery and evaporate a Martian in a penny dreadful is a tool that requires a certain amount of respectful distance. But in a DVD player, the laser was a silent librarian. It didn't touch the disc, it merely rid it with a beam of light. This meant the disc would never wear out. You could watch the same movie 10,000 times, and the 10,000th time would be just as crisp as the first, provided, of course, you didn't use the disc as a frisbee or a coaster for a wet glass of lemonade. The great pan and scan massacre. But the true victory of the DVD, at least in the eyes of a man who appreciates the vista, was the war against pan and scan. You see, a movie theater screen is wide and grand, like the Mississippi at high water. A television set in 1997, however, was a squarish, bulky box that looked like a packing crate for a much smaller, more interesting object. To fit a wide movie onto a square screen, the experts used a process called pan and scan. They would cut off the sides of the picture and move the camera back and forth to follow whoever was talking. It was a visual crime of the highest order. It was like looking at the Grand Canyon through a keyhole. You might see the mule, but you'd miss the sunset and the entire canyon. I have always maintained that if a director puts a character on the far left of the screen and a mountain on the far right, he likely intended for you to see both of them. The DVD introduced the masses to widescreen. Suddenly, our televisions had black bars at the top and bottom. I heard many a man complain about this in 1997. "I paid for the whole screen," they would shout. "Why are there black bars eating my picture?" They didn't realize that the black bars were a sign of respect. They were the curtains of a theater, allowing the movie to exist in its natural panoramic glory. It was the first time the American living room actually looked like a cinema, rather than a place where movies went to be decapitated and shorn of their horizons. The insult of the deleted scenes. However, my admiration for the DVD hits a submerged snag when we come to the special features, specifically the deleted scenes. As a writer, I find the concept of a deleted scene to be an absolute affront to the craft. When I am writing a story, I spend weeks, months, sometimes years, agonizing over which words belong and which words should be taken out behind the barn and shot. When I delete a scene, it is because that scene is a failure, it is a blemish, it is a boring, unnecessary, or ill-conceived piece of slop that threatens to sink the entire narrative. The draft is a secret between the author and his waste paper basket. It is a record of his mistakes, but the DVD decided that the public wanted to see the mistakes. They included a menu where you could click a button and watch the scenes the director had already admitted were not good enough to be in the movie. Think of the vanity of it. Imagine if I released a special edition of Huckleberry Finn that included 3 chapters where Huck and Jim just sit on the raft and argue about the best way to peel a potato, followed by a 20-minute sequence of Tom Sawyer catching a cold. It would be an insult to the reader's time. A storyteller's job is to give you the best version of the truth, not a pile of his discarded laundry. The director's commentary, the man who won't shut up. And then there is the audio commentary. This is a feature where the director and perhaps a few actors sit in a room and talk over the movie while you're trying to watch it. It is the digital equivalent of being stuck in a theater next to a man who has seen the play 6 times and insists on whispering, "Watch this part. He's about to fall down," into your ear for 2 hours. In this scene, the director will say, "We had a lot of trouble with the lighting because the caterer forgot the ham sandwiches." Does this help me enjoy the drama? Does it enhance the tragedy of the hero's death to know that the actor was actually thinking about his lunch? It destroys the illusion. In 1997, we began to care more about how the trick was done than the trick itself. We were becoming a race of behind-the-scenes observers, more interested in the machinery of the theater than the magic on the stage. The fragility of progress. For all its versatility, the DVD possessed a fatal flaw that the old VHS tape did not. It was a delicate, high-strung creature. A VHS tape could be dropped, sat upon, or used as a doorstop, and it would usually still play, albeit with a bit more snow. But a DVD, a single, greasy thumbprint from a child who had been eating jam, could bring the entire production to a screeching halt. The laser would hit that smudge, get confused, and the movie would skip, repeating the same 3 seconds of dialogue over and over again until you felt like you were trapped in a very short, very loud purgatory. It was a technology for the careful and the clean. It was the think different of the living room. It promised perfection, but it demanded a level of domestic hygiene that many of us were not prepared to provide. The end of the rewind ritual. As I look back on the transition, I realize that the DVD killed one of the great social contracts of the 20th century, the Be Kind Rewind rule. There was a certain moral weight to rewinding a tape before returning it to the rental store. It was a small act of kindness for the next stranger who would inhabit that movie. It was a sign that you were a civilized member of society. With the DVD, there was no rewinding. You simply took the disc out and put it back in its case. We were becoming on-demand creatures, stripped of our obligations to those who came after us. We wanted the scene selection menu. We didn't want to wait. We wanted to jump directly to the good parts, which in 1997 usually involved a giant boat sinking or a boy on a broomstick. A final verdict on the disc. The DVD was a magnificent humbug. It gave us the director's cut which is usually just the version of the movie that was too long for the theater, and it gave us subtitles in 16 different languages, allowing a man in Missouri to watch a French tragedy and pretend he understood the nuances of Parisian ennui. It made the world's cinema accessible, searchable, and incredibly easy to smudge. It was the final nail in the coffin of the ephemeral performance. Now everything is recorded, indexed, and provided with a making-of documentary that is twice as long as the film itself. I tip my hat to the digital versatile disc. It brought the Pearl of the Orient and the sinking of the Titanic into our homes with a clarity that would have made a 19th century photographer faint with envy. But as I sit here trying to wipe a smudge off a disc with the tail of my white coat, I find myself missing the old black brick. It was clumsy, it was blurry, and it took forever to rewind. But at least it didn't tell me what scenes it had deleted because it was too embarrassed to show them to me in the first place. Chapter 18. The Path of the Mother. I have frequently remarked that the great architect of the universe has a rather peculiar sense of timing, the sort of timing that would get a playwright laughed out of a theater for being too on the nose. In my time, I saw many a man try to choreograph his own exit from this stage, but the results were usually messy, unscripted, and involved a great deal of ungraceful staggering. However, in September of 1997, the universe decided to stage a double feature of mourning that left the human race emotionally bankrupt and physically dehydrated from a surplus of weeping. Only 5 days after the world had collectively collapsed into a puddle over the tragic end of a princess in a Parisian tunnel, the news arrived that the saint of the gutters, Mother Teresa, had finally decided to turn in her earthly ledger and seek a more permanent residence in the celestial suburbs. It was as if the 20th century, sensing its own fast approaching end, decided to clear out its most prominent residents all at once, like a landlord who had suddenly decided to turn the whole building into a parking lot. The divine deadline. There is something profoundly ironic about dying in the shadow of a global superstar. In 1997, the world's attention was a finite resource, and it was currently being monopolized by the floral tundra at the gates of Kensington Palace, which I discussed in Chapter 6. Then, on September 5th, Mother Teresa passed away in Calcutta at the age of 87. If death is a competition for headlines, a ghoulish thought, I grant you, but one that the newspapers of 1997 certainly embraced, Mother Teresa had the misfortune of opening her final act just as the world was reaching its peak of Diana mania. It was a clash of two very different brands of holiness, one that sparkled in the flashbulbs of the paparazzi, and one that had spent 50 years being slowly withered away by the sun and the dust of the Indian streets. I've always said that heaven is a place where you can stay in bed all day and read. But I suspect that when Mother Teresa arrived at the Golden Gates, she immediately asked for a broom and a bucket of soap to help tidy up the place. She wasn't the staying in bed type. She was a woman who possessed a holy stubbornness that would make a Missouri mule look like a pushover. The geography of the wrinkle. The contrast between the two women was so stark, it almost felt like a parable. On one side of the globe we had Diana, young, radiant, dressed in the finest silks, and tragically silenced in the prime of her life. On the other, we had Teresa, tiny, bent-over woman who looked as though she had been carved out of a very old, very durable piece of driftwood, draped in a $5 cotton sari, and carrying the weight of the world's misery on her shoulders. I have spent many years studying the human face. It is the only map that never lies. Diana's face was a mirror. People saw in it whatever they wanted to find. But Mother Teresa's face was a topographical map of suffering. Every wrinkle was a road she had walked in the slums of Calcutta. Every crease was a story of a dying man she had held in her arms. She proved that there is a certain kind of beauty that only comes from being thoroughly used up by a great purpose. In a decade that was increasingly obsessed with anti-aging creams and the pursuit of a porcelain complexion, Mother Teresa was a walking, breathing reminder that a well-lived life is supposed to leave some marks on the container. The business of being a saint. Now, I have always looked upon organized piety with the same suspicion a cat looks upon a bathtub. I have met saints who were so holy they were no earthly good to anyone, and I have met sinners who would give you the shirt off their back and a cigar to go with it. Mother Teresa, however, was a saint with a remarkably sharp eye for business. She understood that in the modern world, even charity needs a brand. She didn't call it that, of course. She called it God's work. But she was a master of the image. That blue-bordered sari was as recognizable in 1997 as the swoosh on a sneaker or the apple on a computer. She knew that if she wanted to feed the hungry, she had to deal with the wealthy. She moved through the corridors of power, the White House, the Vatican, the halls of the Nobel Committee, with the quiet confidence of a woman who knows she has a more powerful boss than anyone else in the room. I've always admired a good humbug when it's used for a noble cause. She charmed the powerful into opening their checkbooks, and then she took that money back to the gutters to buy medicine and bread. It was a magnificent redistribution of the world's gilt money. She made the rich feel better about being rich, and she made the poor feel a little less forgotten. It was a transaction that even I, a man who has wrestled with his own conscience and lost most of the time, find to be a stroke of genius. The price of the lens redux. If Diana was the first martyr of the information age, Mother Teresa was its most unlikely beneficiary. She used the very cameras that hunted the princess to document the reality of the dying. She understood that a photograph of a starving child in a Calcutta hospice was more powerful than 1,000 sermons. But 1997 revealed a curious thing about the human animal. We love a saint, but we prefer a princess. The outpouring of grief for Diana was a chaotic, hysterical explosion of emotion. The grief for Mother Teresa was more like a quiet, respectful nod. We admire the saint, but we relate to the princess. We see ourselves in the struggles of a woman trying to find love and happiness. We see something other in a woman who spends her life cleaning wounds. Mother Teresa was too good for us to truly feel a kinship with her. She made us feel a bit uncomfortable, like a man in a dusty suit walking into a fancy ballroom. The double heartbreak of 97. The death of these two women, occurring so close together, created a strange atmospheric depression over the world. It felt as if the moral poles of the earth had shifted. One represented the heart of the people, and the other represented the soul of the gutters. I watched as the news anchors, those well-groomed oracles of the 1997 screen, struggled to pivot from the funeral in London to the funeral in Calcutta. It was a sensory overload of tragedy. London, the horse-drawn carriage, the Westminster Abbey, the Elton John song, the candle in the wind. Calcutta, the simple casket, the streets crowded with the poorest of the poor, the saint of the slums being carried on a gun carriage. A strange choice for a woman of peace, I must say. It was as if 1997 had decided to take the world's heart and break it twice, just to see if we were still paying attention. We were online and on demand, but for those few weeks, we were also on edge. We were forced to think about the meaning of a life, not just the fame of it, but the weight of it. A final observation on the path. Mother Teresa once said, "If you judge people, you have no time to love them." I suspect that is why she and I would have gotten along famously, despite our differing views on the utility of tobacco and the existence of a literal purgatory. I am a man who spends a great deal of time judging. I've made a career out of it, but even I can see the gumption in a woman who refuses to look away from the things the rest of us would rather ignore. In a year dominated by the Silicon frontier, by the deep blue computers and the Google indexes, Mother Teresa was the analog reminder of our biological reality. She dealt in the currency of the touch. She reminded us that no matter how many megabytes we have in our pockets, we still possess a fragile, shivering body that eventually needs to be held by someone who gives a damn. As she took her path into the next world, I find myself wondering what the algorithm made of her. How do you index a woman who owned nothing but 2 saris and a pair of sandals, yet could command the attention of kings? You can't. She was offline before it was a choice, and she was think different before it was a slogan. The sunset of 97 saints. By the end of September, the flags were back at full mast. The flowers were being turned into mulch, and the world was turning its eyes back to the Spice Girls and the Titanic. The double tragedy had passed, but something had changed. 1997 had given us a look at 2 different ways to be immortal, one through the image and one through the act. As I look at the world now, I see that we have largely chosen the image. We spend more time posting our virtues than practicing them. I think Mother Teresa would have found the internet to be a very noisy place with very few brooms. She likely would have ignored the social media and gone right back to the gutters. And that, I reckon, is the true mark of a saint. A person who is far too busy with the here and now to worry about the followers. Now, if you'll excuse me, thinking about Mother Teresa has made me feel uncommonly selfish. I'm going to go find a small kindness to perform. Perhaps I'll refrain from insulting a politician for at least 20 minutes. It's not a Nobel Peace Prize worthy act, but I suspect the mother would appreciate the effort nonetheless. Chapter 19. The Path to the Millennium. I have always found that the most effective way to terrify a human being is not to threaten him with a ghost, a graveyard, or a life insurance salesman, though all have their merits, but simply to tell him that his bank account has forgotten how to count. We are a species that lives by the ledger. We believe that as long as the numbers are in their proper columns and the dates are neatly penned at the top of the page, the universe is a stable and predictable place. But in 1997, a peculiar sort of ghost began to haunt the machinery of the world. It wasn't a spirit of the departed, it was a spirit of the incomplete. It was called the Y2K bug, and it was the first time in history that the entire human race became convinced that the apocalypse would be triggered not by a trumpet blast from the heavens, but by a couple of missing ciphers in a box of silicon. The frugality of the fool. To understand the Y2K problem, you must understand that the computer experts of the 1960s and 70s, men who dressed like accountants and possessed the imaginative range of a brick, were remarkably cheap with their digital memory. In those days, storage space in a computer was as precious as a cold drink in the Sahara. To save a few pennies, they decided that a year didn't need 4 digits. Why write 1975 when 75 would do just as well? They assumed that 19 was an eternal constant, like the stupidity of Congress or the humidity in New Orleans. They figured that by the time the year 2000 rolled around, their machines would be in a scrap heap and they would be safely retired in Florida, drinking beverages with umbrellas in them. It was a classic piece of human procrastination. They kicked the 0 down the road, never suspecting that the road was shorter than they thought. Now, in 1997, the world woke up and realized that on the stroke of midnight, on December 31st, 1999, every computer on the planet would see the year 00 and assume it was 1900. The Great Arithmetic Panic. Imagine the catastrophe. To a computer, 1900 is a very different place than 2000. If a bank computer thinks it is 1900, it will look at your savings account, realize you haven't been born yet, and promptly delete your life savings to correct the error. If a hospital machine thinks it is 1900, it might decide that antibiotics are a futuristic hallucination and revert to its default setting of leaping with leeches. Elevators might stop between floors because they haven't been serviced since the McKinley administration. Airplanes might fall from the sky because their internal clocks have decided they are actually steam-powered kites. The experts spent 1997 shouting from the rooftops that the world was about to reset. They spoke of a digital dark age. I sat back with a cigar and marveled at the irony. We have spent a century building a civilization of such staggering complexity that we can send a robot to Mars and a princess to the grave with a push of a button, and yet our entire empire is held together by 2 digits that we were too lazy to write down in the first place. The survivalist humbug. By the middle of 1997, a new industry began to flourish. The Y2K survival industry. I have seen survivalists before. In my day, they were the fellows who moved to the mountains because they were convinced the British were coming back or that the end of days was scheduled for next Tuesday. But the Y2K survivalist was a modern breed. He didn't just buy a rifle and a Bible. He bought a year 2000 compliant generator, 500 gallons of bottled water, and enough freeze-dried beef to feed a cavalry regiment for a decade. People were being told to withdraw their money from banks and hide it in their mattresses. They were told to buy wood stoves even if they lived in a penthouse in Manhattan. They were told to learn how to hunt squirrels, which I find particularly amusing, as most of the people I met in 1997 couldn't find a squirrel if it was sitting on their mouse pad. It was a magnificent humbug of fear. Fear is a very profitable commodity. If you can convince a man that his toaster is going to turn into a homicidal maniac at midnight, he will pay you any amount of money for a special shield to protect his kitchen. We were witnessing the birth of the consultant class, men who charged $500 an hour to tell you that, yes, your computer is indeed stupid, and no, there isn't much we can do about it except bill you for another hour. The parable of the page compositor. I found a certain personal sympathy for the Y2K problem. You see, I was once the victim of a mechanical limitation myself. I invested my heart, my soul, and several fortunes I hadn't even earned yet into the page compositor. That machine was a marvel of 18,000 parts. It could do the work of 6 men, provided you didn't look at it too hard or breathe in its general direction. But it had a fatal flaw. It was too precise for its own good. It would break a piece of type if it was 1/1000th of an inch out of alignment. It was a machine that demanded a perfect world. And unfortunately, I was living in a world made of lead and ink and human error. The Y2K bug was the page compositor on a global scale. We had built a perfect system, but we had forgotten that the system was built by men, and men are, by their very nature, short-term thinkers. We live for 70 years and think we are immortal. We write 97 and think the 19 will always be there to hold our hand. The logic of the idiot box. The most hilarious thing about the Y2K panic was the realization that the smartest machines ever built were, in fact, total idiots. A computer has no common sense. If you tell a human being, hey, tomorrow is the year 00, the human will say, ah, you mean 2000. Pass the ham. But if you tell a computer 00, it doesn't know anything. It just follows its code. It is a creature of absolute, literal obedience. I've always said that the man who does not use his brain has no advantage over the man who does not have one. In 1997, we realized that we had handed over the keys to our civilization to a collection of machines that didn't even have the mental capacity of a well-trained dog. At least a dog knows that today follows yesterday. A computer has to be told that fact every single morning, usually in a language that looks like a cat has walked across a typewriter. The path to the zero. As 1997 drew to a close, the countdown began to feel less like a celebration and more like a fuse burning toward a powder keg. Every new piece of software was advertised as Y2K compliant, as if it were a badge of honor to be able to count to 2000. But I began to suspect that the bug was a bit of a theatrical production. It was too perfect. It was too clean. It gave the experts something to do. It gave the survivalists something to buy. And it gave the newspapers something to shout about now that the princess was gone and the comet had faded. I've noticed that when the world is faced with a truly terrifying problem like poverty or war or the fact that my hair won't stay down in a light breeze, we usually ignore it. But give us a mechanical bug that we can fix with a bit of code and several $1 billion, and we're all over it like a duck on a June bug. We love a problem that has a technical solution. It makes us feel like we are in control of the ship, even when the ship is currently heading for an iceberg at 20 knots. A final thought on the millennium. The path to the millennium was paved with good intentions and bad arithmetic. 1997 was the year we realized that the future we'd been dreaming of was built on a very shaky foundation of shortcuts and savings. We were online, on demand, and on edge. We were waiting for the zero to arrive. I found it quite poetic. The zero is the symbol of nothingness, the great void. And yet, the entire world was terrified that this nothing would be the thing that finally broke the everything. As for me, I wasn't worried. I've lived through several ends of the world, and I've noticed that they usually pass without much fanfare, leaving us with nothing but a few extra cans of beans and a lingering sense of embarrassment. I suspect that when the clock strikes midnight in 2000, the sun will still rise, the taxes will still be due, and my computer will still find a way to tell me that my password is incorrect. Because if there is one thing more reliable than a bug, it is the cussedness of the machine and the folly of the man who built it. Chapter 20. The Midnight of 97. And so we arrive at the end of the ledger. It is December 31st, 1997. I am sitting in a chair that feels remarkably like 1897, clutching a pen that still requires the occasional dip in an inkwell, yet I am surrounded by a world that has decided to trade its soul for a collection of glowing pixels and a handshake that sounds like a robotic cat in a blender. As the clock ticks toward midnight, I find myself contemplating the sheer, unadulterated gumption of this year. It was a year that didn't just pass, it performed. It was a three-ring circus where the acrobats were cloned sheep, the lions were British pop stars in Union Jack dresses, and the clowns were all working for IBM, trying to explain why a chess-playing toaster was the pinnacle of human achievement. I've spent a lot of time on the Mississippi, and I know the feeling of the water changing right before a storm. The air gets heavy, the birds go quiet, and you can feel the current shifting under the hull. 1997 was that shift. We are no longer drifting. We have been caught in a bit stream, and the rapids are coming up fast. The year of the great online. If I were to sum up 1997 in a single word, aside from humbug, which I find applies to most things, that word would be online. Before this year, online was something you did with your laundry on a sunny Tuesday. But in 1997, it became a state of being. We spent the year tethered to our phone lines, listening to the 56K scream, waiting for the World Wide Web to tell us something, anything, that would make us feel connected. We Googled things we already knew. We chatted with strangers in distant lands while ignoring the spouse sitting 3 feet away. And we convinced ourselves that because we could see a grainy photograph of a Martian rock, we were somehow more enlightened than our ancestors. I've seen the human race try to connect before. I remember when the telegraph first spanned the continent. We thought it would bring universal peace because surely if men could talk to each other instantly, they would realize they had no reason to fight. We were wrong then, and I suspect the internet is proving us wrong again. All we've done is give every man in the world a megaphone and a soapbox. And then we act surprised when the world becomes a very loud, very crowded, and very angry place to be. The on-demand delusion. 1997 was also the year we became on-demand. We decided that waiting was a primitive relic of the 19th century. We wanted our movies in red envelopes. We wanted our Spice Girls on screen 90 minutes at a time. And we wanted our Harry Potter magic to arrive exactly when we felt like being enchanted. We have lost the patience of the raft. In my day, if you wanted to see the sunset, you had to wait for the sun to actually go down. If you wanted to hear a story, you had to wait for the storyteller to finish his pipe and find his voice. But the Silicon frontier doesn't have time for pipes. It wants the deleted scenes now. It wants the search result in under a second. We are becoming a race of spoiled infants, screaming for our digital porridge the moment we feel a pang of boredom. We have traded wonder for convenience, and I fear that in the bargain, we have forgotten how to appreciate the slow, magnificent unfolding of a real life. If you can fast forward through the boring parts, eventually you'll realize that the boring parts were the only things holding the story together. The on-edge anxiety. And finally, we were on edge. 1997 was a year of profound, twitchy anxiety. We listened to Radiohead sing about paranoid androids, and we felt a spark of recognition. We looked at Dolly the sheep and wondered if we were next. We looked at the Y2K bug and realized that we had built a golden age on a foundation of zeros. We have built a world that is so complicated that nobody actually understands how it works anymore. We are like a man who has built a magnificent clock with 10,000 moving parts, only to realize he's lost the key and the spring is starting to groan. We are on edge because we know that we are one glitch away from a digital dark age. I watched the children of 1997 playing with their Tamagotchis, those little plastic eggs that contain a digital pet that dies if you don't press a button every 20 minutes. It is the perfect metaphor for the age. We have created life that requires constant mechanical attention, and if we look away for even a moment, the heart stops, and we have to hit the reset button. The farewell to the century's heart. But amidst all the beeps and bloops and humbugs, 1997 took the time to break our hearts. The loss of the princess and the saint within a single week was a double clapper of grief that silenced even the loudest modem. It reminded us that for all our Think Different slogans and our titanically sized movies, we are still just fragile, breathing creatures who can be extinguished in a tunnel or a gutter. We spent 1997 trying to be fitter, happier, and more productive. But at the end of the day, we were just humans standing in a pile of flowers, wondering where the grace went. We realized that you can't download a soul and you can't search for a saint. Those things have to be built one day at a time through the messy, unindexed work of being alive. The Midnight Ball. As I sit here, I can hear the distant sounds of celebration. The New Year's Eve ball is preparing to drop in Times Square. People are wearing 1998 glasses, a fashion choice that I find to be a severe indictment of the human aesthetic. And they are raising glasses of champagne to toast a future that they are both terrified of and desperate to inhabit. The fin de siècle is no longer a fancy French phrase found in literary journals. It is a countdown. We have 2 years left before the zeros arrive. I've always said that the only way to stay ahead of the end of the world is to be the one who started it in the first place. But I think I'll just sit this one out. I've seen enough progress for 1 year. I've seen the future, and while it's undeniably versatile and remarkably digital, I find that it's lacking in a certain amount of porch time and a significant lack of good cigars. A final toast from the river. So, here is my final report on the year 1897. I mean 1997. It was a grand, beautiful, ridiculous, garanga-ing mess of a year. It was the year we realized that we are no longer the measure of all things. The machine has taken that yardstick and hidden it behind a password. But I have a secret for you as the clock strikes midnight. The machine might be faster, it might be smarter, and it might be able to calculate 1,000,000,000 chess moves while you're still trying to find your shoes. But it will never be able to tell a lie as good as mine. It will never know the joy of a humbug or the sorrow of a candle in the wind. We are the only creatures in the universe who can watch a Titanic sinking and think it's romantic. And as long as we stay that way, as long as we stay messy, emotional, and profoundly illogical, the zeros will never truly catch us. I'm going to go turn off my OK computer now. I've had enough of the Silicon Frontier for one night. I'm going to go find a real dog to pet, a real book to read, and a real fire to sit by. Happy New Year, you paranoid androids. Try not to reset yourselves before breakfast. I'll see you in 1998, provided the handshake doesn't kill me first. The end. This has been Mark Twain,